If you're suffering, you are obligated, in a sense, to hold on to whatever rope someone throws you. Life can be meaningful enough to justify its suffering. You can tyrannize yourself into doing things, but I wouldn't recommend it. What I would recommend instead is that you ask yourself what you're willing to do. It's a really effective technique. It's like a meditative technique. That's when life is worthwhile. I don't know exactly what's going to help you, but don't arbitrarily throw out any possibilities because you might not have that luxury. Antidepressants help a lot of people, and there are technical reasons why that's the case. If you're offered a gift by your society and it works, try it. I don't care what your presuppositions are. The time you see people who are suffering with depression, for example, there's a multitude of reasons, but I'll take one common reason. You could think about it as associated with the story of Peter Pan. Peter Pan is someone who won't grow up, right? Now the problem with Peter Pan is he gets to be king, but it's king of Neverland. Neverland doesn't exist. So being king of nothing isn't that helpful. Well, one of the things that you often see with people who suffer from depression, and I'm not making a blanket statement about the cause of depression because there's lots of them, is that people who don't have enough order in their life tend to get overwhelmed. So for example, if someone comes into me to see me and they say they're depressed, I always ask them a very standard set of questions. Do you have a job? If you don't have a job, you're really in trouble in our society. First of all, your biological rhythms tend to go off the rails right away because there's no reason to go to bed at any particular time and there's no reason to get up. And for many people, if they don't get up at the same time, they foul up the functioning of their circadian rhythms, and that's enough to make them depressed right off the bat, especially if they start napping during the afternoon. They also don't have a purpose. People aren't good without a purpose, and this isn't hypothesizing. We absolutely understand the circuitry that underlies positive emotion. When you're attending to something you're interested in and you're engaged in it, that's when you're alive. That's when life is worthwhile. It's so worthwhile that in those moments you don't even ask the question about it. The question itself goes away because the meaning that you're united with is so powerful that it can push back the adversity that would otherwise characterize life. Nietzsche said, the person who has a why can bear any how. We know how it works. Almost all the positive emotion that any of you are likely to experience in your life will not be a consequence of attaining things. It will be a consequence of seeing that things are working as you proceed towards a goal you value. That's completely different, and you need to know this because people are often stunned. For example, they finish their PhD thesis and their presupposition is that they're going to be elated for a month, and often instead they're actually depressed, and they think, oh, what the hell, I've been working on this for 7 years and I handed it in, and what do I do now? And that's what depresses them, right? It's the what do I do now? Well, they're fine if they enjoyed it pursuing the thing. As long as it was working out, they get a lot of enthusiasm and excitement out of that because that's how our nervous systems work. Most of your positive emotion is goal pursuit emotion. If you take drugs like cocaine or amphetamine, the reason they're enjoyable is because they turn on the systems that help you pursue goals. That's why people like them. So if you don't have a job, you got no structure, that's not good. Plus, you tend not to have a point. So you're overwhelmed by chaotic lack of structure and you don't have any positive emotion.
We've met some of your fans, and we got the impression they were all male fans, the ones that we talked to, and that they were struggling with their manhood, and that you give them this message that it's okay to be a man.
It's not okay. It's necessary. What the hell are we going to do without men? You look around the city here, you see all these buildings go up, these men, they're doing impossible things. They're under the streets, working on the sewers, they're up on the power lines in the storms and the rain. They're keeping this impossible infrastructure functioning, this thing that works in a miraculous manner. They work themselves to death, and often literally, and the gratitude for that is sorely lacking, especially among the people who should be most grateful. You see university professors, especially of the social justice bent, who are among the most protected and privileged people that the world has ever produced. They take everything they have for granted, failing to understand entirely that there's a massive infrastructure of unbelievably hardworking, solidly laboring, working class men breaking themselves in half on a regular basis making sure that everything that always breaks works. And so a little gratitude for that is in order. And it's very useful to tell everyone, not just men, that they have an important role to play, a necessary role, and that if they act properly and honestly and forthrightly, that they can put their lives together and they can help their families and they can make their communities better, and that that's not toxic masculinity, that appalling phrase. It's what keeps the world going round. If we had any sense, we'd understand that, instead of doing everything at every possible moment to label what we have in the West as oppressive and patriarchal and fundamentally predicated on power, of all the insane propositions. My audiences are often composed mostly of men between, say, 20 and 35, not exactly young, but young enough. And they're desperate for a discussion about responsibility and fair play and noble being and working properly in the world, and and to hear the idea that their lives actually matter, that if they straighten themselves up and fly right, that they'll have a beneficial effect on themselves and their family and the community, and that the world is starving for that. And for them as individuals, not for them as a group, but for each of them as individuals. So, yeah, it breaks me up. Every time the topic comes up, it breaks me up, because it's so damn sad. And we're so stupid. We're alienating young men. We're telling them that they're patriarchal oppressors and denizens of rape culture and you know, tyrants in waiting, and we fail to discriminate between their competence and their tyranny. And it's awful. It's so destructive. It's so unnecessary, and it's so sad. And so whenever I think about it, especially because of all that I've seen of it, it makes me sad, like deeply. It's so sad. One of the things that I think this heightens the meaning in your life, is to try to do difficult things, right? Aim high. Don't aim so damn high you can't manage it, and make sure you break down your aims into reasonably attainable sub-goals, but you want to aim high, and then you want to see how hyper efficient you can get. That's a great thing to do in your early 20s, is to see, okay, like, discipline yourself. You think, okay, how much work can I do if I load myself right to the maximum? How far can I work? How hard can I work until I exhaust myself? And then you back off, obviously, because the optimal amount of working, productive engagement, let's say, is that which is sustainable across decades. So you have to learn that, but you don't learn that without stretching yourself to your limits to begin with. And, you know, if your life isn't everything it could be, and if you're suffering from an excess of meaninglessness, well, it means you're not oriented in the world of chaos and order properly. It's like you could learn to discipline yourself. Figure out what it is that you need to do and that you want to do, and then see how efficient you can get. Because one of the things that's quite fun is to figure out, if you have a task, I always tell my graduate students this if they're doing an experiment too. If you have a task that you have to do, it's really interesting to spend a few minutes, sometimes hours, depending on how long the task is. See if you can figure out how to do it from 5 to 10 times faster. It means you'll have to rearrange the way you think about it, but you can often do it. And that's how extremely productive people get so hyper efficient.
The internal problem is, how do you deal with tragedy and malevolence? And you can say, well, I'm not prepared. It's like, yeah, fair enough. Unsurprising, especially if you were overprotected as a child. It's not a good idea to overprotect your kids, because the snakes are going to come into the garden no matter what you do. And so then you, instead of trying to keep the damn snakes away, what you do is you arm your child with something that can help them chop them into pieces and make the world out of them. So that the trick for human thriving in the face of suffering and malevolence is strength, not protection. It's a completely different idea. We also know this clinically. We know, for example, that if you treat people with exposure therapy for agoraphobia, which is, roughly speaking, the fear of chaos, I would say, the fear of everything, you don't make them less afraid. You make them braver. It's not the same thing. Because with an agoraphobic, see, what happens to them is the fall. They never conceptualize death and suffering. They're naive. Right? It never enters the theater of their imagination, and it's because they're protected from it. But then something happens. This often happens to women in their 40s because they're the people most likely to develop agoraphobia. Something happens. They've been protected from chaos by authority their entire life. So maybe they had an overprotective father, and then they went to an overprotective boyfriend, and then they went to an overprotective husband. And maybe they were willing to be subjugated to all three of those because of the protection, right? So that's the bargain. They stay weak and dependent, and maybe they have to because that's the only way they can appeal to the person who's hyperprotective. But the price they pay for that is that they're not sufficiently competent. And then something happens in their life, often in their 40s. They develop heart palpitations, maybe as a consequence of menopause. Their heart starts to beat erratically, and they think, oh no, death. It's like, well, who are you going to talk to about that? Right? There's no protection from authority for that. Or maybe their friend gets divorced, or maybe their sister dies, or something like that. It brings up the specter of mortality, and maybe the specter of malevolence and mortality, and it brings it up in a way that authority, recourse to authority, cannot solve. And so then they have panic attacks. What happens? They go out, they get afraid, they feel their heart beating, then they get afraid of their heart beating because they think, oh no, I'm going to die, and they think, oh no, I'm going to die, and I'm going to make a fool of myself while I'm doing it and attract a lot of attention. So the two big fears come up: mortality and social judgment. And then they have a panic attack. It's like fight or flight's gone out of control. Very, very unpleasant. Then they start to avoid the places they've had a panic attack. Then they end up not being able to go anywhere. So then Tiamat has come back, right? A huge monster, a little victim. And so what do you do with them? Well, there's no saying, no, there's no Tiamat. That's done, right? Their naivety is over. They've had a direct contact with the threat of mortality and social judgment. They've met the terrible mother and they've met the terrible father. And there's no going back. There's no saying, oh, the world is safe. It's not safe. Not at all. It's not safe. The fact that you think it's safe means that you were living in an unconscious bubble that was sort of provided to you by your culture. It's a gift. And now that's been shattered. And so now what do you do? Well, the answer is you retreat until you're in your house and there's nowhere you can go. You're the ultimate frozen rabbit, right? And your life is hell because you can't function. The alternative is, let's take apart the things you're afraid of. Let's expose you to them, carefully and programmatically. And then you'll learn that you're actually tougher than you think. You never knew that. And maybe you didn't want to take on the responsibility because, people play a role in their own demise, so to speak. When you had opportunity to go out and explore or withdraw because you were afraid, you chose to withdraw because you were afraid. So it's not only that you were overprotected often, it's that you were willing to take advantage of the fact that you were overprotected and run back there whenever you had the opportunity. So maybe you're a kid in the playground, right, and you're having some trouble with other kids, and in the back of your mind, I should deal with this myself, but you go and tell your mom and get her to intervene. And you know that that's not right. You know that you're breaking the social contract, but it's easier, and so that's what you do. You run off to an authority figure and hide behind the Great Father, roughly speaking. Well, the problem with that is you don't learn how to do it yourself. So then you have to relearn it painfully when you're 40. So then you take people out. You say, well, what are you afraid of? Rank it from 1 to 10. So 10 is, we'll make a list of 10 things you're afraid of. The thing you're least afraid of, we'll call number 10. So we'll start with that. Okay, well, I'm afraid of elevators. Okay, well, let's look at a picture of an elevator. Let's have you imagine being in an elevator. Let's go out to an elevator and let you watch the terrible jaws of death open, because that's how you're responding to it symbolically, right? And you're going to do that at the closest proximity you can manage. You find out, you go do that, it works. You're nervous as hell, especially from an anticipatory perspective. Shaking. You go out, you stop, you watch it happen, and you actually calm down. You do that 10 times and it no longer bothers you. Well, what you've learned that you didn't die, but more importantly than that, you've learned that you could withstand the threat of death. That's what you've learned. And then you move a little closer, and then you move a little closer, and then you move a little closer, and finally you're back in what's no longer the elevator from a symbolic perspective. It's a tomb, right? It's a place of enclosure and isolation. And you learn, turns out I can withstand that. And then you're much more together, much more confident. And that's often one of the things that often happens in situations like that. I've seen this multiple times, is that if you run someone through an exposure training process like that and toughen them up, they'll often start standing up to people around them in a way they never did before, because they wouldn't stand up for themselves before because they weren't willing to undermine the protection. See, if you're protecting me, I can't bother you because I can't afford to forsake your protection. So if I'm going to play that game, I'm going to hide behind you, then I can't challenge you. So that's no good, because that's sometimes why people, you see this with guys very frequently, they're still deathly afraid of their father's judgment when they're in their 30s or 40s. It's like, well, why? No, because they still want to believe that there's someone out there that knows. And so they're willing to accept the subjugation because it doesn't force them to challenge the idea that there's someone out there that knows. Because that's the advantage of having your father as a judge, right? Because he knows. Well, what if he doesn't? What if no one knows any better than you? Well, that's a rough thing. You don't, until you realize that, you're not an adult, right? That's really technically the point of realization of adulthood, is that no one actually knows what you should do more than you do. I mean, it's a horrible realization, because what the hell do you know? It's a terrible realization, and people will often pick slavery, permanent slavery, to the spirit of the Great Father, let's say, over that realization, and it's completely understandable. But the problem with it is that there's more to you than you think, and so if you continue to hide behind that figure, then you never have a chance to understand that there's more to you than you think, far more to you than you think. Maybe there's enough to you so that you can actually withstand the threat of mortality without collapsing, maybe even withstand the threat of malevolence without collapsing. Who knows? It's certainly possible. And it's not an abstract question. It's exactly the sort of question that you address in the psychotherapeutic process. It's always the question that you address. And the answer is often in the affirmative, because people can get unbelievably tough. And you know that because people work in emergency wards in hospitals, right? Or they work in palliative care wards, or they work as mortuary assistants. I mean, these people have bloody rough jobs, you know, or they're on the front line of police investigation into, you know, heinous child abuse crimes, and so they're confronting malevolence on a regular basis. And, you know, those are very stressful jobs. But people do them, and some people do them without even being damaged by them, although that's a harder thing, because you can see horrible things, you know, things you'll never forget.
You have to be tough as a damn boot to be good, because you have to stand your ground when you need to stand your ground, and you have to be able to say no when it's time to say no, and you have to mean it. And so then you have to think and plan strategically so that when you're going to say no, you can mean it and it will stick. You know, and that takes a certain amount of integrated malevolence, I would say. And once it's integrated, it's not malevolence, it's strength. It's strength of character. It's the ability to stand your ground. And you have to cultivate that. And you cultivate that, at least in part, by telling the truth. And so you take your place in the world as a decent person and as a decent citizen, and you play the hierarchical game properly. And that is to stand up straight with your shoulders back. It's like the world's an onslaught. You've got the tyranny of culture to deal with. You've got the catastrophe of nature. You've got your own damn malevolence and ignorance, right? All coming at you, plus the incredible, complicated, indeterminate potential of the future. That's all coming at you, and it's all your responsibility. And you can cringe away from it and be afraid of it and be victimized by it and be bitter and cynical about it. And no wonder, because it can be painful. Or you can turn around and you can say, man, bring it on, because there's more to me than there is to the catastrophe. And this is what I discovered from looking at what I looked at. I looked at the darkest things I could look at, really, for 30 years. I was really a lot of fun to be around, I can tell you. I looked at the darkest things that I could think of, right? Not only what happened in Auschwitz and what happened in the Gulag, but personal issues. You know, it's like I wasn't so much interested in the totalitarians as a group. I was interested in the people who undertook the terrible acts that the totalitarians required. You know, the people who, I was just rereading Ordinary Men, and it was a story about a police battalion in Poland that trained ordinary policemen to take naked pregnant women out into the fields and shoot them in the back of the head. It takes a lot of training, by the way, before you can bring yourself to do that. And you aren't the same person by the end of it. It's pretty goddamn horrific. You know, and I was trying to figure out, what would it be like to be that person? Because we are that person. And then what would it be like to not be that person, right? To refuse to do that, to not participate in that. You know, and what I discovered by making that totalitarian proclivity personal was that there's more to us than there is to the horror. As nature is, bent on our destruction, bad as culture is, tyrannical and bloody, back as far as you can look, as malevolent as you are in the darkest part of your heart, and that's plenty malevolent. The possibility that's within you that can well up, the courage and the truth and the ability and the skill and the willingness to set things right, if you are willing to set them right, is more powerful than all of that. And so it's so interesting. It was proof for me of an old saying I read from Carl Jung. It's an alchemical motif, in stir qualinus inventur, which is what you most want to be found will be found where you least want to look, essentially. And it's so interesting because it means that if you're willing to turn around and to stand up straight and face the darkness like fully, what you discover at the darkest part is the brightest light. And that's something that's so much worth discovering, because there's going to be terrible darkness in your life. And it's going to make you cynical and bitter. And it could easily be that you're just not looking at it enough. Because if you looked at it enough and you didn't shy away and you brought everything you had to bear on it, you'd find that there was more to you than there was to the horror. You know, I watched my father-in-law. I'll end with this. And you know, you don't know, because you're not bringing your A game to the table with all that cynicism and bitterness and resentment and willful blindness and avoidance. Maybe you're playing at 60%. It's not good enough because there's too much of what's bad for 60% to be good enough. It's like you need 90% or 95% or 100%. When about 15, 20 years ago, my mother-in-law developed frontal temporal dementia, which I wouldn't recommend. You know, it's one of those degenerative neurological diseases like Alzheimer's, and those bloody things are like they're in the top echelon of awful. You know, you watch a person deteriorate before your eyes. It's a lengthy, lengthy death. And it was slow. And her husband, he lived in this little town that I grew up in, about 3,000 people. And he was quite a character, man. Everybody knew him. I bought him a Foghorn Leghorn t-shirt once, because that's kind of what he was like. He was loud and sort of bombastic, but he stood up straight, I can tell you. And he played the fool a little bit, mostly for the amusement of people, but he was no damn fool. And I always admired him and liked him. And the feeling was mutual, thank God, since I married his daughter. And, you know, he drank a lot with his crazy friends up in northern Alberta, and he wasn't at home a lot because he was working a lot. And you know, he was kind of a party animal about town, but a good businessman and a good man. And then his wife got sick, and they moved to another town. And, you know, he took care of her for like 15 years. It was unbelievable as she deteriorated, you know, and she got more desperate to have him around, and her love for him never went away. Even as she lost herself almost completely, she would always light up when he came into the room, you know. And he took care of her right till within weeks of her death. He had to finally put her in an old folks' home because he was no longer strong enough to lift her up from the chair. And we interacted with him a lot, you know, because we were trying to help him figure out how to cope. And we had signs put up in the house, electronic signs that would tell her when he was leaving, so that she would know where he went. And we had recordings in the bathroom so that she knew what to do when she went into the bathroom. And we tried to do everything we could to not make this absolutely bloody, atrocious experience complete hell. And he participated the whole way, you know, and it was really something to see. It was really it left me with a tremendous sense of admiration for him, but not just for him, but for people who can do that. You know, and if there was a new decline, he took it on, and he didn't complain about it, and he tried to do what he could, you know, and like it was no picnic, don't get me wrong, but it wasn't hell. And then we were all gathered around the deathbed, my wife's mother's deathbed, and the family was there, and they got along pretty well, you know. Her sister's a palliative care nurse, and the other one's a pharmacist, and none of them are particularly afraid of illness and death. You know, they're a pretty tough group. And so, you know, they made sure their mother's lips were wet while she was no longer eating or drinking, and tried to make her comfortable. And they're around the deathbed, and they were kind of getting along, you know. It wasn't Family Feud at mother's death time, and that was kind of nice. And she died, and that was that. But it wasn't just that, because the fact that the family had coped with it well and nobly and honorably, I would say, brought them together. They were closer afterwards than they were before. And they all had more respect for their father. And then in the old folks' home, he met another woman who had a husband there who had Alzheimer's, and they got to know each other, you know, and he died after a while, and she died after a while, and then a few months later they started going out, and then eventually they had a relationship, and now they live together. And so he gained something. Like, it wasn't that he replaced what he lost, you know what I mean? Because he still has pictures of his wife up in his house, and she was the love of his life, and that's not going away. But, you know, his family respected him more, and everybody pulled together more, and it wasn't hell at the deathbed, it was just tragedy, and the family pulled together more. And that was a good example of how you can extract at least a certain amount of light out of what's dark, even at a personal level. And it's worth asking yourself. It's like, drop what you're doing that's foolish, that you know is foolish, and pick an aim that's worthwhile, you know, to make things better for yourself, like you're worth taking care of, like you're worth something, you know, and to surround yourself with people who believe the same, and who are, rejoicing in your accomplishments and unhappy when you fail, right? And you're comparing yourself to your accomplishments of yesterday and not to someone else's today, so that you're not jealous and bitter. And you put your own house in order so that you're not cursing the world when some of its disarray might be your fault. And you're trying to pursue something meaningful, and you're doing your best to tell the truth, and all of that. And then you see what happens. Who the hell are you? You know, you think you're a miracle of some bloody bizarre sort. We've been around for 3.5 billion years. You know, every single one of your relatives propagated successfully. And here you are, against all possible odds, in this world of hell in some sense, and bitterness and tyranny and malevolence. And yet, God only knows what's inside you, this capacity for consciousness, the capacity to confront potential and to turn it into something good. That's us, man. That's the Western story. That's the individual as the cornerstone of the state. That's our responsibility, and it really is who we are.
Carl Jung talked about this phenomenon he described as retrogressive restoration of the persona. It's a complicated idea, but basically what it means is that sometimes you take a leap forward and you learn some things, but you can't catalyze a new identity, so you try to go back and hide in your old identity. And that actually doesn't work, because, well, things have changed and you've learned something, and that isn't who you are anymore. And so it's like you have to cut parts of yourself off in a destructive manner to fit back into the person that you were. Now what happens here is that Pinocchio escapes from this tyrannical situation and undergoes this descent into chaos, but he tries to go back home. He tries to go back to what he was. And he can't do that anymore. His father isn't at home anymore. And so when he goes home, he finds that there's no home there. Now, this happens to people sometimes, and it's often a shock to them. So they'll often stay under the thumb of their father. And you think, well, why would someone do that? Because it means they're subject to the tyrannical judgment of their father. They're always concerned about what their father would think, or whether their father approves of them, and so forth. And you think, well, that's got to be an unpleasant place to be. Why would you do that? Freud said, for example, that no one could be a man unless his father had died. And Jung said, yes, but that death can take place symbolically. Okay, so there's that part of the idea. And then another part of the idea is One of the times in your life when you actually realize that you're an individual is when you'll go and ask your parents something and you'll realize they actually don't know any more about what you should do than you do. And that sucks. And that's partly why people are often willing to maintain a tyrant-slave relationship with their father. It's like, on the one hand, you have to be inferior in a relationship like that. You know, you've always got the judge watching you. But on the other hand, there's always someone who knows what to do. There's always someone standing between you and the unknown that you can go ask, what should I do? Well, at some point, you'll realize that the reason you can't ask that anymore is because they actually don't know any more than you do. And then that's a pain. Like that is a symbolic death. And that's also when you establish a more individual relationship with your parents. It's at that point that you could conceivably start taking care of them instead of the reverse. And that's a time that should come. But you have to let that image of perfection go. And that exposes you. Well, that's what happens here. You know, Pinocchio goes home and he wants things to be the way they were, and he wants to stay under the careful care of the benevolent father, but that's no longer possible. He's past that point, and that's why the father has disappeared. And so Geppetto has gone off to look for Pinocchio because he also needs his son, but in any case, the house is abandoned. And so then we see inside the house that everything's covered with cobwebs and everything's gone, and Pinocchio and the cricket sit on the steps and they're very concerned. First of all, they wonder where he went, so they're actually concerned that he's gone, but they also don't know what to do because there's just no going home. And so, you know, that's also the case that once you hit a certain point in your development, well, it's the same thing we already talked about. The answers that you're looking for are not going to be found in your parents' house. It's as simple as that. Now, you could artificially maintain your dependency, but, you know, if you do that for too long, things get pretty ugly. It's very helpful for people to hear that they should make themselves competent and dangerous and take their proper place in the world.
Competent and dangerous?
Mm-hmm.
Why dangerous?
Because it's the alternative to being weak. And weak is not good. The people who shoot up the high schools, they're weak. They're weak.
How is it good to be dangerous?
Because it makes you formidable. And life is a very difficult process. And you're not prepared for it unless you have the capacity to be dangerous. That doesn't mean that you should be cruel. It doesn't mean any of that. There's a statement in the New Testament, the meek shall inherit the earth. But the meek isn't well translated. It means something more like those who have swords and know how to use them but keep them sheathed will inherit the world. That's a way better way of thinking about it. You have to be powerful and formidable and then peaceful, in that order. And that's not the same as being naive and weak and harmless, which is what young men are being encouraged to be. It's like, that's a very bad idea. It's a very bad idea. Because naive, weak, and harmless means that you can't withstand the tragedies of life. You can't bear any responsibility. You'll end up bitter. And when you get bitter, then you get dangerous.
But one thing I'm not getting, there's a big difference between letting people do something for themselves and saying men should be dangerous. By dangerous, that implies I should be ready to threaten someone, to hurt somebody.
No, you should be capable of it. But that doesn't mean you should use it. There's nothing to you otherwise. Like if you're not a formidable force, there's no morality in your self-control. If you're incapable of violence, not being violent isn't a virtue. People who teach martial arts know this full well, right? If you learn a martial art, you learn to be dangerous, but simultaneously you learn to control it. Both of those come together. And the combination of that capacity for danger and the capacity for control is what brings about the virtue. Otherwise you confuse weakness with moral virtue. I'm harmless, therefore I'm good. It's like, no, that isn't how it works. That isn't how it works at all. If you're harmless, you're just weak. And if you're weak, you're not going to be good. You can't be, because it takes strength to be good. It's very difficult to be good. People are afraid of the truth because often if you reveal it, it causes conflict in the moment. Telling the truth is definitely an adventure. Seeking for sure, but also telling. Another way of going about it is to just say what you think and see what happens. That's an adventure, because you don't know what the outcome is going to be. So look, there's this old idea that it's necessary to have faith in the truth. And so here's a way of thinking about that. Someone asks you a question and you might think, well, here's the outcome I want, and so here's how I'm going to answer that question. So that's one way of approaching it. But another way of approaching it is, you ask me a question, I'm going to think about the answer, and I'm just going to tell you what I think. And it doesn't matter what the outcome is, because I'm willing to see what the outcome will be.
predicated on the idea that there isn't a better outcome than the one that truth produces. Even if it's harsh and terrible in the short term, and sometimes it is, it's like there isn't a better way of doing it. Now, you might say, well, how do you know that? And the answer is, well, I don't know that. That's why it's an article of faith, because I believe, and I believe this deeply, the being that you produce as a consequence of telling the truth is good, by definition, even though it's harsh and often uncomfortable, because you get in trouble. One of the things that I've really learned recently, or learned to articulate better, is that there's a very tight relationship between aspiration and responsibility. The first question might be, do you need to aspire to something? And the answer is, well, yes, because you have to do something. You can't, if you just sit there, you'll die. You can't just sit there. You have to go act out in the world. Okay, so act towards what? Well, that's whatever your aspiration is. You have to have an aim. Okay, well, what should the aim be? Well, it should be something worth doing, let's say. Why do something that you don't feel is worth doing? What do you think's worth doing? Well, if you watch other people and you judge when they're doing something worthwhile, you usually judge them positively if you see that they're taking responsibility, at least for themselves. But you want to be completely useless so other people have to take care of you? That's pretty pathetic. And maybe you could get your act together so you're taking care of yourself and your family. And maybe you could even do better than that and take care of yourself and your family and your community. Well, good for you. That's responsibility, and that's an aim. Well, here's one of the things that's cool about that, is that your life doesn't have meaning without aspiration or an aim. Okay, so you need a hierarchy of values. There's got to be something at the top. It's got to be something important. If you don't have that, your life doesn't have any meaning. So if you criticize the hierarchy, or even the idea of hierarchy, you destroy the idea of aspiration, and then people have nothing. Well, that's not helpful. People are built for a struggle, and they're built for a weight, and you want to take on a heavy burden voluntarily. See if you can put yourself together. See what you can do out in the world while you're waiting to die. It's an all-in game. It better be worthwhile.
You need a family, you need friends. Like, you don't need to have all these things, but you better have most of them. Family, friends, career, educational goals, plans for, time outside of work, attention to your mental and physical health, etc. That's what life is about. And if you don't have any of those things, well, then all you've got left is misery and suffering. So that's a bad deal for you. So, number one, specify your damn goals, because how are you going to hit something if you don't know what it is? That isn't going to happen. And often people won't specify their goals too, because they don't like to specify conditions for failure. So if you keep yourself all vague and foggy, which is real easy, because that's just a matter of not doing as well, then you don't know when you fail. And people might say, well, I really don't want to know when I fail because that's painful, so I'll keep myself blind about when I fail. That's fine, except you'll fail all the time then. You just won't know it until you've failed so badly that you're done. And that can easily happen by the time you're 40. You would like to be productive and have a good life, and that's how you make the schedule. It's like, and then you look at the day and you think, well, if I had that day, that'd be good. Great, and you're useless and horrible, so you'll probably only hit it with about 70% accuracy, but that beats the hell out of 0, right? And if you hit it even with 50% accuracy, another rule is, well, aim for 51% the next week, or 50.5% for God's sake, because you're going to hit that position where things start to loop back positively and spiral you upward. So that's one way that you can work on your conscientiousness, is plan a life you'd like to have. And you do that partly by referring to social norms. That's more or less rescuing your father from the belly of the whale. But the other way you do that is by having a little conversation with yourself about, as if you don't really know who you are, because you know what you're like. You won't do what you're told. You won't do what you tell yourself to do. You must have noticed that. It's like you're a bad employee and a worse boss, and both of those work for you. You don't know what you want to do, and then when you tell yourself what to do, you don't do it anyways. But, my point is that you have to understand that you're not your own servant, so to speak. You're someone that you have to negotiate with. And you're someone that you want to present the opportunity of having a good life to. And that's hard for people, because they don't like themselves very much. They're always like cracking the whip and then procrastinating, and cracking the whip and then procrastinating. And it's like, God, it's so boring and such a pathetic way of spending your time. And you know what that's like, because you probably waste like 6 hours a day. What you do now is going to multiply its effects in the future. And you need to know what your damn time is worth. One of the things you should be asking yourself is, when you spend an hour, was that, well, what if I paid someone $50 to have had that hour?
And if the answer is no, it's like, well, maybe you should do something else with your time. And it depends on whether or not you think that your time's worthwhile. But the funny thing about not assuming that is if you assume your time isn't worthwhile, what happens is you don't just sit around sort of randomly in a state of responsibility-less bliss. What you do is you suffer existentially. Someone who is incapable of cruelty is a higher moral being than someone who is capable of cruelty. And I would say, and this follows Jung as well, that that's incorrect, and it's dangerously incorrect, because if you are not capable of cruelty, you are absolutely a victim to anyone who is. And so part of the reason that people go watch anti-heroes and villains is because there's a part of them crying out for the incorporation of the monster within them, which is what gives them strength of character and self-respect, because it's impossible to respect yourself until you grow teeth. And if you grow teeth, then you realize that you're somewhat dangerous, or maybe somewhat seriously dangerous, and then you might be more willing to demand that you treat yourself with respect and other people do the same thing. And so that doesn't mean that being cruel is better than not being cruel. What it means is that being able to be cruel and then not being cruel is better than not being able to be cruel. Because in the first case, you're nothing but weak and naive. And in the second case, you're dangerous, but you have it under control. And you know, a lot of martial arts concentrate on exactly that as part of their philosophy of training. It's like, we're not training you to fight. We're training you to be peaceful and awake and avoid fights. But if you happen to have to get in one, and I guess the philosophy also is that if you're competent at fighting, that actually decreases the probability that you're going to have to fight, because when someone pushes you, you'll be able to respond with confidence, and with any luck, and this is certainly the case with bullies, with any luck, a reasonable show of confidence, which is very much equivalent to a show of dominance, is going to be enough to make the bully back off. And so the strength that you develop in your monstrousness is actually the best guarantee of peace. And that's partly why Jung believed that it was necessary for people to integrate their shadow. And he said that was a terrible thing for people to attempt, because the human shadow, which is all those things about yourself that you don't want to realize, reaches all the way to hell. And what he meant by that was, it's through an analysis of your own shadow that you can come to understand why other people are capable, and you as well, of the sorts of terrible atrocities that characterized, let's say, the 20th century. And without that understanding, there's no possibility of bringing it under control. When you study Nazi Germany, for example, or you study the Soviet Union, particularly under Stalin, and you're asking yourself, well, what are these perpetrators like? Forget about the victims, let's talk about the perpetrators. The answer is, they're just like you. And if you don't know that, that just means that you don't know anything about people, including yourself. And then it also means that you have to discover why they're just like you. And believe me, that's no picnic. So that's enough to traumatize people, and that's partly why they don't do it. And it's also partly why the path to enlightenment and wisdom is seldom trod upon, because if it was all a matter of following your bliss and doing what made you happy, then everyone in the world would be a paragon of wisdom. But it's not that at all. It's a matter of facing the thing you least want to face.
Are you depressed, or do you just have a horrible life? And those are not the same question, because if you're depressed, you have a life that in principle should work, but isn't. And so you come and say, look, I've got a lot of things going for me. You know, I've got a good job, I've got a good family, my wife loves me, but man, I'm miserable all the time. It's like, okay, well, let's delve into that a bit more deeply. But that kind of sounds like depression. But then you might come and say, well, I'm miserable, I'm suffering, I don't even want to be alive. And then I might ask, well, do you have an intimate partner? Well, no, not really. And I have had a history of catastrophic relationships. Do you have any friends? Well, you know, I have this one person I phone like once every month or so. But other than that, no, I don't really see anyone. Well, do you have any close family? No, my family's pretty fractured. I don't get along with my mom and dad. I don't see my sisters or my siblings much. It's like, well, how about a job? Or how about a career, or failing that, a job? It's like, well,
I've always kind of been underemployed, and I just lost my job, and you know, that's not going very well, and so on. You can walk through someone's life, and you can find out if they're reasonably embedded in a hierarchy of social institutions. And if the answer is no, no intimate partner, no family, no children, no friends, no job, no career, no educational pathway, no engagement in civic responsibility, let's say, no church attendance, no spiritual life, no routine. It's like, well, you're not depressed, you just have a horrible life. Multidimensionally. Like, it's no wonder you're depressed. There's nothing in your life that is working. But it's interesting because that's not exactly a diagnosis at the level of the individual. It's a diagnosis in relationship to the relationship between the individual and this structure of containing social institutions. If you don't have an intimate partner, and you don't have a family, and you don't have any friends, and you don't have a career or a job or any civic involvement or any involvement, let's say, with religious institutions, and you don't have any creative striving, all you've got left is pain. And so that's what you have. And so here's a different way of thinking about sanity. Sanity isn't being well constituted as an atomized individual. Sanity is what makes itself manifest if you're properly situated in a hierarchy of social order. To be well constituted, you have to be a harmonious player in a multidimensional symphony in some real sense of social interaction. It's very hard to stay on the straight and narrow without a partner who doesn't share your blind spots, correcting you constantly. You know, now that's annoying. There's a tussling about it, right? There's a fractious and adversarial element to that, because if you're married, you don't see eye to eye, and thank God for that, because sometimes in your foolish insistence on being right, you're wrong, and wrong in a way that'll take you out. And so you better have a partner who doesn't think the same way you do. And fortunately, if you have a partner, you have a partner who doesn't think the same way you do. And so if you can get the dialogue flowing, then that's a mutually corrective mechanism. And so then you might say, well, the truthful dialogue between partners in a marriage is actually, it's the process by which sanity itself is generated. And I mean technically, it's like you're too complex to regulate yourself, period. And so you need other people to help you do that. So if you have a wife or a husband, someone who knows you and is there for the long run, they can help, you can help each other find the meaningful path and stay on it. And you can't do that alone. And probably just having a partner isn't enough. You need kids, likely, to keep you sane or to drive you crazy, depending on the nature of your children. Let's say you need family, you need your parents, you need your siblings, you need another community around you that's not merely your wife, because you're so crazy that it takes a village to keep you sane. And so, and then surrounding that more intimate web of kinship, you need friends. And friends keep you sane. Well, how? Well, you have to act in a manner that makes them want to be around you to have friends. And that means that to maintain your friendships, you have to be saner than you really are, right? You have to be, they have to be able to enjoy their time with you. If you practice forthright and voluntary exposure to that which terrifies and dismays you, it transforms you. And we really know this as psychologists. We even know there's more and more evidence suggesting, for example, that if you imagine you adopt this attitude of voluntary confrontation, that changes you psychophysiologically. So all Much of the biochemistry of motivation and emotion is transformed when you take a stressor, which could be oppressive and paralyze you and cause you to withdraw, and you reverse that and you decide to advance. It's like a different spirit inhabits you. And I mean this physiologically. There's a whole different pattern of being that makes itself manifest in you neurologically and psychophysiologically and pharmacologically. So you take it on as a challenge, right? And that transforms you at a cellular level too, because one of the things we've discovered in recent years is that if you do something new and complex, then that turns on that parts of your DNA that haven't produced proteins before will start producing new proteins and reconstruct you from the cellular level up. So it's a deep transformation, and we have no idea how deep. And again, you could ask yourself, if you didn't withdraw in fear from anything from everything that life threw at you, who could you become? And I would say that's the central religious question in some real deep sense. You know, are more things thrown at us than we can manage? Well, that's a tricky question, because pretty dreadful things are thrown our way. And you might say, well, that's just presents an insuperable barrier to progress. That's not very helpful, because you're alive, here you are, you've got these problems to contend with, and if it's an impossible task, then how could you be anything but hopeless and desperate? But then you think, well, wait a second, how would things transform if I took this on as a voluntary adventure? You know, regardless of its scope, and the scope would include unjust suffering, death, and hell. And that's not just some religious or metaphysical vision. It's like, no, you're actually going to have to contend with that in your life, in whatever way those things make themselves manifest to you personally. That's coming, man. And so maybe you better get prepared. And then the question might be, well, what would happen if you got prepared? And the answer might be, you'd be prepared. And I think the religious enterprise in its deepest sense is that process of preparation. And you know, you might want to even push that a bit farther. You might say, well, not only do you want to get prepared for what's coming your way, but you want to be so prepared that when it comes your way, that it doesn't make you bitter and resentful and tempted by the desire to walk the path that would make all of that even worse. And so you might say, well, if you could really face up to what you need to face up to, not only could you turn yourself into someone that could bear the catastrophe of life and exposure to hell, but maybe you could turn yourself into someone who would still do good even while facing those things. And that's a pretty noble goal. You're sitting on the edge of the bed trying to have an honest dialogue with yourself, and the little voice says, you know, it's pretty disgusting in here. And you think, well, I'm way above such trivial niceties as organizing my room. It's like, well, that's pride. That's arrogance. If you're above organizing what's actually yours, how in the world are you ever going to organize anything else? And so you get on your knees and you think, well, it's time to, you know, take a brush to the toilet. And maybe that's where you start. And that works. Like, that works. You start making those micro improvements, like real micro improvements, real on the ground, actual micro improvements to things you know that are wrong, you'll improve unbelievably rapidly. There's always people out there who are doing far better than you on pretty much anything you want to imagine. And if all you're doing is seeing yourself in their reflected light, let's say, then it's going to be pretty damn dismal. But it's not a good comparison because, well, first of all, there's danger in just comparing yourself to others, period, because they're not you. And God only knows what struggles they had to undertake to get to where they were, or what burdens they're currently carrying that you're not aware of. But you can certainly contrast yourself with yourself. And that's a lot better. It is the only way. Well, it's also the only way of really measuring anything approximating proper improvement. You can actually tell when you're a little better than you were yesterday.
Right. And you can actually do that. That's another thing that's so interesting about it, is that you can actually make yourself a little better in some way, pretty much. Well, I don't know if it's at every moment, but you can certainly do it every day. Let's say you want to become who you could be in the fullest sense. So let's say you're someone who's going to solve some serious problems. Okay, the first thing you have to do is admit to the seriousness of the problems. That's no joke. And so the first thing is just the terror of the problem itself. And that's enough to paralyze you, right? And that's the Hydra, that's the Gorgon with the head of snakes. It'll paralyze you and turn you to stone. That's the basilisk in the Harry Potter series. You look at it and it turns you to stone and lurks underneath everything, right? And it's malevolence and tragedy. And so there's that. And then the next is, well, you're going to take responsibility for that? You're really going to do that, are you? That's a hell of a load, man. And so it's daunting to even consider that. And then there's the discipline and responsibility that necessitates, which is also daunting. It's like, oh my God, the problem's that serious. I'm really going to have to get my act together in order to not contribute to it, much less solve it. And so the problem is terrible. And then the solution is daunting. But the upside of that is like, well, there isn't anything better to have than a problem that's worth solving, like that's really worth solving, right? And so the more of that you take on, the more you have a reason to get out of bed in the morning, no matter what. Like, I'm getting up, I'm trudging forward. Doesn't matter what I'm suffering from. I've got things that need to be done. They're necessary. And that gives you that sense of purpose that is the antidote to bitterness. Okay, well, let's say you want your life to be meaningful. It's like, okay, then what you do matters. It actually matters.
Or how starting to clean up the room changed their life. That's quite fun because it's something I always tell people to do instead of going out and protesting. Jesus, I just can't stand
Cleaning up
that.
the room?
Yeah.
Meaning?
Well, my sense is that if you want to change the world, you start from yourself and work outward because you build your competence that way. It's like, I don't know how you can go out and protest the structure of the entire economic system if you can't keep your room organized. Well, I made a video which was called Message to Millennials, where it was called How to Change the World Properly. A bit of it on the pretentious side, I suppose, but I was trying to produce something that was a counterposition to this idea that what you should do is go out and fix up other people. You know, that's just not right. And there's a New Testament line about that, something about, you know, not worrying too much about the log in your neighbor's eye or about the speck in your neighbor's eye when you have a log in your eye. What would the world be like if people stopped avoiding the things they knew they should do? You know, because the question is, how much are we contributing to the fact that life is an existential catastrophe and a tragedy? How much is our own corruption contributing to that? That's a really worthwhile question. The things you leave undone because you're angry, you're resentful, you're lazy, you have inertia. Well, you consult your conscience and it says, well, you know, that place over there could use a little work. It's the same as working on yourself, and so you clean that up because you can. And then things are a little clearer around you. And you're a little better off because you've practiced a bit, and so you're a little stronger, and then something else manifests itself and says, well, maybe you could like take a crack at fixing me up too. So you decide to do that, and then that gets a little bit more pristine, you know, and soon, and it's humble because you're not exceeding your domain of competence. You know, it's like, don't be fixing up the economy, 18-year-olds. You don't know anything about the economy. It's a massive, complex machine beyond anyone's understanding, and you mess with it at your peril. So, and can you even clean up your own room? No. Well, you should think about that. You should think about that.
You only have to ask a stupid question once. You ask a stupid question, and if you're in a crowd and you ask a stupid question, 80% of the people in the crowd have the same question. They're just too cowardly to ask. But you ask and then someone actually tells you, you never have to ask that question again. You're no longer stupid.
What stupid thing am I doing that I could quit doing? That I would quit doing? Because those aren't the same thing, right? Because you know there's stupid things that you're doing that you're just not going to quit doing because you like them. But there might be something on the edge there where you could stop that. If you want to know something about yourself, sit on your bed one night and say to yourself, you got to mean this, like you got to be desperate. This is no game, this. My life is not everything I want it to be, and perhaps it's not everything that I need it to be. And by need, I mean my life is so unbearable that the suffering that's attendant upon that is make me nihilistic, cynical, bitter, resentful, driving the proclivity to see evil everywhere except within my own heart. Like, these are problems, man. And you ask yourself, you sit on the bed and say, okay, man, I'm ready to learn something. What's one thing I'm doing wrong that I know I'm doing wrong that I could fix, that I would fix? It's like, you meditate on that, you'll get an answer. And it won't be one you want, but it'll be the necessary one. You know, and it's often something that will point you to small things. Like, that works. You start making those micro improvements, like real micro improvements, real on the ground, actual micro improvements to things you know that are wrong, you'll improve unbelievably rapidly.
There's never been a better time for the majority of people to be alive. And the future, although we're vulnerable and terrible things can always happen to us, it's hard to make a case that the future doesn't look comparatively positive. We're becoming extremely technologically sophisticated, and the world is changing at an incredibly rapid rate. And the only way we're going to be able to manage that in a positive way is if each of us, or as many of us as possible, are capable of making wise and careful and truthful decisions. And if we do that, then maybe things can continue to improve. You don't get people to stand up on their own 2 feet and to adopt responsibility if everything is given to them. And that's a real conundrum.
If you write a book, which is virtually impossible, and then get a publisher, which is virtually impossible, you probably have a rejection rate of 99%. So then if you do manage to publish the book with a reasonable publisher, which you won't because it's impossible, then you get 8% royalties. That's it. So 92% of your labor goes to the sales, marketing, and distribution end of things. And so it's very, very difficult to generate capital as an entrepreneur. And there's innumerable impediments. One of the things that people do, and this is something for those of you who might be entrepreneurially minded, here's another thing that you have to understand, is that you can't really create a product and then launch it. Because first of all, you don't know how to do that. You might know how to create the product, but you do not know how to market or sell it. You don't know how to advertise it. You don't know how to communicate about it. You don't know how to ship it. Like, there's all sorts of things you just don't know. But worse is you don't know if people will use it. And so what companies do that roll out new products on a relatively continual basis do is they don't develop the product and then go sell it. They continually communicate with their customers about what product the customer is willing to buy next, and then they develop that. And so you have to have your market identified, and then you have to be in continual communication with the market while you develop the product. It's not, I build a better mousetrap and the world comes, marching to my door. That isn't how it works. Is that you got to find out if someone wants to buy your stupid thing. And then the next thing is that even if you have a great thing, you're going to go talk to people and they have 50 great things that they might buy. And they're all great, but they're not going to buy all 50. They might buy one, maybe, and maybe they'll buy it this week, but probably they'll buy it in 6 months. And they're not going to buy any of them, no matter how great, unless they're on fire and you're selling water. Because they're so busy already, right? They're so overwhelmed and preoccupied by their jobs that if you come in and you say, well, here, this is going to increase your efficiency by 20%, and here's the 3 weeks you'd have to spend doing that, and then the payoff would come in the next years, they'll say, yeah, well, I'll do that as soon as I have time. And as soon as I have time is never. So if they're on fire and you have water, you can sell it to them. But that's all, because otherwise it's a no-go. So those are all things that are worthwhile knowing, because they're very hard to learn. And very comically, I mean, if you would have told me when I first started developing these tests that one of the reasons corporations wouldn't buy them was because they worked, that I would have just thought, really? I mean, come on, really? That's really the reason? It's like, yeah, that's the reason. God. So very, very, very problematic. And then they already have their processes in place and they're entrenched. And then the next problem is, you haven't got any customers. I think I told you that before. You don't have any customers and you show them the statistics, but they can't understand the statistics. And they also have 200 other people selling them things, and 50 of them are crooks. So they're just lying about what they're doing, and they can't tell the difference between the liars and the people who are telling the truth. And so they can't understand the statistics for themselves, and they can't verify them anyways. So what they ask you is, who else is using it? And if the answer is, well, everybody, then you don't even have to do the sale because you're already rich. And if the answer is nobody, then they're going to say, well, why is nobody using this? You say, well, it's the hottest thing that's come along. And they think, well, I'm not going to be the sucker who gets painted, you know, red and fired because this failed. That they do not think this might make me succeed. People do not care about whether or not they succeed. They care about whether or not they fail. And so that's another thing, is that if you're marketing something and you can say this will stop you from being identified as a failure, then people might be happy about that. But if you say this will really help you succeed, it's like, yeah, no, I don't want to succeed. I just don't want to fail. I don't want to succeed. I just want to be invisible and be left alone. And if you're looking for people's fundamental motivation, that's it. It's they want to be invisible and they want to be left alone. I tell you the zebra story? Any of you know that story? Okay, I'll tell you this zebra story. Stop me if I've told it to you before. This tells you everything you need to know about human beings. So it's worth knowing. Okay, so zebras have stripes. And people say, well, that's for camouflage. And then you think about that for 2 seconds and you think, that's a really stupid theory, because lions are camouflaged and they're like golden like the grass. And zebras are black and white, so you can see a zebra 5 miles away. It's like, there's a zebra, it's black and white. So the whole camouflage thing, that's just not working out so well as a hypothesis. Okay, so biologists go and they decide to take a look at some zebras. And so they're looking at a zebra on the herd, because there's no zebra, right? Just like there's no fish. There are schools of fish and there are herds of zebras. There isn't a fish. This is why I think the cod aren't coming back. There are no cod. There are massive 100-mile-long schools of cod, 10 stories deep, 20 million years old. You wipe out the school, you don't just get to throw a cod in the water and say, well, you know, off you go. It's like, well, where's my city? It's like launching you in the middle of a field. It's like, well, go out there and reproduce. It's like, no, that's not going to happen, you know? So without the school, there's no cod, and you can't just introduce a whole school of cod because you don't have a whole school of cod. So, you know, maybe the cod are never coming back. And zebras are the same thing. There's not a zebra. There's zebras. And so you're looking at the zebras, trying to study a zebra, and you look at the zebra and you make some notes and you look up and you think, oh, Christ, which zebra was I looking at? And the answer to that is you don't know, because the camouflage is against the herd. And the black and white stripes. There's a variety of reasons for the stripes. Flies also seem not to like the stripes, but you know, usually things evolve for multiple reasons. But anyways, it's very difficult to parse out a zebra against the herd. You look down, you look up, it's like, uh-oh, all those damn zebras look the same. Yes, the camouflage is effective, but it's against the herd. All right, so then you think, well, we better identify a zebra so we can see what he's up to. So then you take your Jeep and a can of red paint and a stick with a rag on the end of it, and you drive up to the zebras and you paint their haunch red a little bit, put a nice red dot on their haunch, or maybe clip their ear with a cattle clip. And then you stand back and you think, hey, I'm pretty smart, now I'm going to watch that zebra. So what do you think happens to the zebra? The lions kill it. Right. Because lions, they're smart, right? Hunting animals are smart. But they have to identify a zebra before they can organize their hunt. They can't just hunt the whole herd. They have to pick out a zebra. And so maybe it's like a zebra that's got a sore hip or something. And so you think, well, nature's kind. It just takes the weak. It's no, zebra or lions like really healthy, delicious zebras. But they look like all the other healthy, delicious zebras, so they can't get a bead on them. But if they're small and just born, or if they're limping, or there's something that identifies them, then the lions can pick them out. And then they do pick them out. And so the rule for human beings is keep your damn stripes on so the lions don't get you. And I'm telling you, man, if you want to remember one thing from my class about human motivation, that's a good thing to learn. People camouflage themselves against the herd, and they like to be in the middle of the herd, which is what fish do, by the way. If you have a big school of fish, the smart, healthy, large fish are in the middle of the school. Because you know what you call fish on the outside of the school? Bait. Right. So that's what people are doing. They're trying to move into the middle of the herd all the time. And the herd moves around, or the school moves around, and people are going, well, I'm in the middle. I'm staying in the middle here. So I've got this protective ring of people around me so the predators don't pick me out and do me in. So Okay, so that's part of the reason why I said, well, you can't sell something to someone for success, because you know, you're thinking, well, people are aiming at success. Don't be thinking that. It's not by any means necessarily true. Trait neuroticism is a powerful motivator. And trait neuroticism is, let's not be too threatened or hurt, right? That's the negative emotion system. And the negative emotion system is a killer source of motivation. You know, you also see that there are scales of well-being that have been designed, mostly by social psychologists, which means they're very bad scales most of the time, because their psychometric capacity is absurdly low, generally speaking. So what you find with scales of well-being, sometimes they're talked about as scales of happiness even, is that people aren't after happiness, they're after not hurting. It's not, so they don't want to be extroverted and enthusiastic, right? And bubbly and full of smiles and laughter. That isn't what they mean by I want to be happy. What they mean is I don't want to be anxious or in pain. And so well-being scales tend to be something like emotional stability plus extroversion. But the big loading is on emotional stability, the reverse of neuroticism. You want to avoid suffering. You don't want to be happy. You want to avoid suffering. And one way to avoid suffering is not to let the lions gnaw on you. And one way of doing that is to stay in the middle of the damn herd. And so, like, I'm not being a smart aleck about this. I understand why people do that. There's real danger to being visible. There's real danger in being visible. Now, you might be successful if you're visible, but you also might be dead.
And I would say you don't just have to face the reality of unjust suffering and death in your life. You have to face the reality of hell. And you might say, well, I don't believe in hell. It's like, well, do you believe in Nazi Germany? You know, do you believe in the Stalinist Soviet Union or Maoist China or Cambodia? That's hell. And you can assess that more deeply. You could say, well, that's not even hell. That's not as precise a formulation of hell as you might be able to conceptualize. Hell is actually participation in the process that led to the establishment of those countries. And that's something that human beings do. And the fact that we do that is something we have to face. And maybe that's even worse than death. And I think you can make a case for that. I really do. I think there are things in life that are worse than death. There are things in life that are worse than unjust suffering and death. And the things that lead to hell are worse. And you might think, well, I don't have to worry about that. It's like, yeah, you do, as a matter of fact, because you're going to face those things too. And you're going to face that when you face your own malevolence, which you will, and you're going to face that when you face the malevolence of others, including the mob. And some of that's just death and tragedy, and some of it is something far darker and deeper than that. And so, yeah, you face that. And so that's kind of interesting. And then you might think, well, how should you face that? And that's where Tammy's story is relevant. It's like, well, so she went and swam with the sharks. And I wasn't very happy about that because our life has been adventurous enough. I thought, do you really need to go swim with the sharks? And the answer seemed to be, well, that would be an adventure. And, you know, I don't interfere with her when she's having an adventure. She's going to go have an adventure. It's far be it for me to interfere. And then she told me, you know, that you had to look the shark in the eye or it would think you're prey. Think, well, what do you have to look in the eye so you're not prey? And, you know, human beings have been trying to figure that out for a long time because we're strange animals because we're predators, but we're also prey. And so I guess at any moment you're sort of deciding, well, are you a predator? Are you the thing that's on top or are you prey? And you're prey if you turn tail and run. And there's a psychological truth there, like a deep psychological truth. And it seems to be something like if you practice forthright and voluntary exposure to that which terrifies and dismays you, it transforms you. And we really know this as psychologists. We even know there's more and more evidence suggesting, for example, that if you imagine you adopt this attitude of voluntary confrontation, that changes you psychophysiologically. So much of the biochemistry of motivation and emotion is transformed when you take a stressor which could be oppressive and paralyze you and cause you to withdraw, and you reverse that and you decide to advance. It's like a different spirit inhabits you. And I mean this physiologically. There's a whole different pattern of being that makes itself manifest in you neurologically and psychophysiologically and pharmacologically. So you take it on as a challenge, right? And that transforms you at a cellular level too, because one of the things we've discovered in recent years is that if you do something new and complex, then that turns on that parts of your DNA that haven't produced proteins before will start producing new proteins and reconstruct you from the cellular level up. So it's a deep transformation. We have no idea how deep. And again, you could ask yourself, if you didn't withdraw in fear from anything from everything that life threw at you, who could you become? And I would say that's the central religious question in some real deep sense. You know, are more things thrown at us than we can manage? Well, that's a tricky question, because pretty dreadful things are thrown our way. And you might say, well, that just presents an insuperable barrier to progress. That's not very helpful, because you're alive, here you are, you got these problems to contend with, and if it's an impossible task, then how could you be anything but hopeless and desperate? But then you think, well, wait a second, how would things transform if I took this on as a voluntary adventure? You know, regardless of its scope, and the scope would include unjust suffering, death, and hell. And that's not just some religious or metaphysical vision. It's like, no, you're actually going to have to contend with that in your life, in whatever way those things make themselves manifest to you personally. That's coming, man. And so maybe you better get prepared. And then the question might be, well, what would happen if you got prepared? And the answer might be, you'd be prepared. And I think the religious enterprise in its deepest sense is that process of preparation. And you know, you might want to even push that a bit farther. You might say, well, not only do you want to get prepared for what's coming your way, but you want to be so prepared that when it comes your way, that it doesn't make you bitter and resentful and tempted by the desire to walk the path that would make all of that even worse. And so you might say, well, if you could really face up to what you need to face up to, not only could you turn yourself into someone that could bear the catastrophe of life and exposure to hell, but maybe you could turn yourself into someone who would still do good even while facing those things. And that's a pretty noble goal, you know, because it's realistic. It's not naive at all. It says, look, man, you know, trouble's coming your way, and it's real. And yet it's possible that you could confront that and still do good in the deepest sense. It's like, well, that's quite something. It would be really quite something if that's true. And one of the preconditions of that would be faith, I suppose. And in some sense, that's what Tammy was manifesting when she went down and swam with the sharks. Faith that if she looked the bloody predator in the eye, that would solve the problem. And then you think too, well, could it be any other way? It's like, well, we have all these problems in our lives, and we could think there's two possible ways of approaching those problems. One would be we just ignore them in the hopes they would what? Go away? Well, and no one thinks that's, no one who isn't a child thinks that, and very few children. Nobody believes that. We know perfectly well that if you got to face something, man, you better face it. And if you're going to face it, that's probably the best pathway forward. And then you might think, well, what does that mean ultimately? And it might mean something like, face it, you know, as deeply as you possibly can and as voluntarily as you possibly can. And there's an element of faith in that, because you have to put yourself on the line. But you're kind of stuck with that anyways. You know, that's the rub.
So the existentialists, this is what they were concerned about. You know, and the locus of their concern was basically It was basically Nietzsche. And you all know that, and the reason I concentrate on Nietzsche and also on Dostoevsky is because I think those two people summed up the 19th century. I really think that. And that the problems that they laid out and predicted would unfold in the 20th century were the problems that unfolded in the 20th century. So they got their predictions right. And I think they got their causality right too. And given the inability of social scientists, including psychologists, to predict large-term mass events, the fact that these two people managed it 30 to 40 years before the events unfolded, and even longer than that, seems to me that it's pretty much worthwhile to consider them psychologists. And certainly Nietzsche thought that of himself, and so did Dostoevsky for that matter. And they had immense influence on people like Freud and Jung and Rogers, all the people that we've been studying. Their thinking is lying underneath every issue we've discussed. This is Nietzsche's, one of Nietzsche's great statements. Of what is great, one must either be silent or speak with greatness. With greatness, that means cynically and with innocence. What I relate is the history of the next 2 centuries. I describe what is coming, what can no longer come differently, the advent of nihilism. Our whole European culture is moving from some time now with a tortured tension that is growing from decade to decade as towards a catastrophe. Restlessly, violently, headlong, like a river that wants to reach the end, that no longer reflects, that's afraid to reflect. He that speaks here has, conversely, done nothing so far but to reflect, as a philosopher and solitary by instinct, who has found his advantage in standing aside, outside. Why has the advent of nihilism become necessary? Because the values we have had hitherto thus draw their final consequence. Because nihilism represents the ultimate logical extension of our great values and ideals. Because we must experience nihilism before we can find out what value these values really had. So one of Nietzsche's claims, for example, was that as Christianity in Europe transformed itself into science, he felt that one of the advantages to the Catholic domination of Europe for so many centuries was that the mind of the Catholic adherents who took the discipline seriously, or the dogma seriously, learned to interpret all events under the schema of a single theory. And he thought about that as a form of discipline. So you could imagine that if I want to teach you how to theorize, I might teach you a theory and have you adopt it. And Nietzsche's point would be that, well, that means you know a theory, but it also means something else. It also means that now you know how to theorize. And the important consequence of learning a theory may not be the theory. It may be that you've learned to theorize. Now, Nietzsche also pointed out that once you learn to theorize, you can separate yourself from the theory that gave rise to that knowledge. And so you can start to theorize even about the theory that you mastered. And he thought that's what happened to Europe as a consequence of its domination by Christianity, especially because of Christianity's essential insistence on the utility of the truth. Now, he thought that was transformed after Catholicism into scientific investigation, but that the spirit of theorizing and truth remained intact, and then that the consequence of that was that the European mind was disciplined by a dogma, then it freed itself from the dogma, then it turned its power on the dogma, and noted that the dogma itself seemed to be grounded in nothing that you could get a grip on, the way you grip things with an empirical mind. And so it fell apart. You know, and that's not saying much more than science posed a fatal challenge to religion. But it's saying it in a much more profound and interesting way. And it also explains why he makes this claim, that nihilism is the logical conclusion of the great values and ideals. So he didn't think about nihilism as a counter proposition, say, to dogmatic Christianity. He thought about it as the logical outcome of that. So now you think, well, is that relevant? Why is that relevant? Well, I think it's relevant for a lot of ideas, for a lot of reasons. The first question is, or the first observation might be, that a tremendous amount of mental illness, and this is an existential claim, is grounded in nihilism. When someone who's depressed comes to see you, what they often say is, I can't see any point in life. And that isn't what they mean. What they mean is, they see the meaning of life as suffering, which is a meaning, right? And that's not bearable. And then the question is, given that, why bother with it? And that's the fundamental question of suicide. And it's a philosophical question. I think it was Camus who said that the only real philosophical question was whether or not to commit suicide. Now, you know, that's a little dark. I mean, maybe old Camus could have used some SSRIs, but you get the point. And it's inappropriate, in my estimation, to even discuss something, even to discuss depression with someone who's depressed, especially if they're intelligent and open, and therefore more tilted towards philosophical wonderings, without actually addressing the issue. Why live in the face of suffering? Okay, so that's one problem. It's to the degree that you will find it difficult in your life to build anything solid under your feet that you can stand on and believe, have faith in, let's say, you're going to be adrift. And the reason for that is, a lot of the things you're going to have to do will be difficult and they'll involve suffering, which is also an existential claim. So the existentialists, for example, they don't make the same claim Freud does. Freud claims that, in some sense, that the normal person is mentally healthy, apart from the mild distress of normal life. And then in order to be psychopathological, you have to have been hurt. And maybe multiple times, and there's other things that could contribute to that, but the existentialists would say, no, let's just wait a minute here. Maybe the fundamental condition of human beings is nihilism and suffering, and that something has to be produced to counter that in order for life to be tolerable. Well, I think that's a perfectly reasonable proposition. Now, it's a strange proposition, because I've seen, in my lifetime, I've seen people who are tormented by existential ideas, who can't get them out of their mind, you know, ideas that relate to the meaning of life, and then other people, and concern about death, for example, and the extinguishing of everything that seems to have any value. It's a primary concern with them. And then I've seen other people for whom those questions never seem to arise. Now, I think those people are, first of all, I think they're conservative people. I don't think they're very open, and I think they're probably rather low in neuroticism. So they're not philosophically curious. They don't go up chains of abstractions. And even if they do, they don't necessarily get disturbed in the most profound areas of their being by the questioning. But that still leaves plenty of people in the other category. Now, the nihilism, well, you know, nihilism and atheism are closely related. I don't think they're identical by any stretch of the imagination. Although I think it's difficult for atheism to describe why it's not essentially nihilistic. And that's Dostoevsky's big criticism, because Dostoevsky's claim was that without any fundamental value assumed, then there's no reason why you can't do anything you want. And that's his famous line, if there's no God, then everything is permitted. And all of Dostoevsky's novel writing is an exploration of that idea. And sometimes it's an exploration of what that idea might mean if it was acted out in the life of a given individual, and so that would be, say, Crime and Punishment. And another would be, say, in his book, The Devils or the Possessed, it's an examination of what that idea means if it's gripped by an individual who has social and political ambitions. And that's when Dostoevsky basically prophesied, so to speak, that one of the consequences of the death of God would be the rise, basically, of communist totalitarianism, because essentially that's what he predicted in The Devils. So that's pretty dead-on accurate prediction. It was really quite stunning to me when I came across it. And Nietzsche made exactly the same prediction, by the way. And so for those two men, the death of an ultimate meaning system, especially one that, you see, when you think about something like European Christianity, it's misleading in some sense, because the system of beliefs that constituted European Christianity and other great belief systems wasn't 2,000 years old. It was like 25,000 years old. You know, you can think about it as beginning at year zero, but it's a mistake from a historical perspective. The ideas that that profound religious traditions are predicated on are generally grounded in ideas that are much, much older than the traditions themselves. And so, in some sense, when at the end of the 19th century, when things fell apart for us and we could no longer rely on our history-predicated morality to guide us, it wasn't merely that we lost an overlay, a psychological overlay that had been laid on humanity for 2,000 years. It was way deeper than that. We don't even know how old those ideas are. We have some idea about how old they are. They're at least as old as written culture. But we also know that the people who have been brought into the mainstreams of history, you know, as the world has united, the people who were not literate had mythologies that drew from the same themes. And some of those people, as far as we can tell, had lived a lifestyle that was essentially unchanged for 25,000 years. And so the Australian Aborigines are like that. So there's plenty of evidence that these ideas are extraordinarily old. And what that means is that when we separate from them, in some sense, not only do we separate from our philosophical presuppositions, but we separate from the historical consequences of our biology. It's a serious problem. And I think that's partly why it's very difficult to distinguish between someone who's nihilistic and someone who's mentally ill. That's not a radical claim. I mean, people, especially who are on the depressed side of the distribution, will tell you that they're nihilistic. You know, they may not use that terminology, although they often do. I just can't see any point. It's like, well, why does that matter? Why does it matter? It seems to be a fact that it matters. So it's an interesting fact. That's a phenomenological fact in some sense, because one of the things that Heidegger pointed out, and he was a founder of the phenomenological school, was that your primary orientation to the world, he thinks in a strange way, that your primary orientation to the world was one of care. So you could say, well, what characterizes your experience? What sort of creature are you? And Heidegger's answer would be, well, you're a creature who cares about things. Insofar as you're engaged in the world, your primary orientation is one of care. And you can think about that as a value, right? It's a consequence of your value orientation, and God only knows where that comes from. Part of it's biological, part of it's developmental, part of it's historical. It's very, very complex. But if you stop caring about everything, you're in trouble. And that's one of the things that seems to indicate that caring is actually a fundamental reality. You stop caring about things, you don't stop suffering. And it seems that unless the caring counterbalances the suffering, you can't maintain an even keel. And that's partly because it doesn't seem just, right? I mean, when terrible things happen to people, they always say, well, two things. How is it that being could be constituted in this manner? Like, what the hell's going on at the fundamental levels of reality that such suffering has to be the case? You'll certainly ask that if you have a child who's diagnosed with cancer, for example. Or you might think, well, why is this cruelty, as it appears, necessarily aimed at me right now in this place, when hypothetically it could have not happened at all, or perhaps been visited on someone more deserving, you know, which is the good are punished and the evil remain unpunished, something like that. So that produces, for human beings, that produces a cry it's a cry for justice. How can the world be constituted that way? And that seems to be built into us. Those aren't questions we can just avoid. They're questions that will arise in your psyche. They'll arise as fundamental questions when sufficiently terrible things happen to you. So the existentialists would say, well, those are conditions of existence. You're just stuck with that. It's part of human nature. It's part of human being to be perplexed by those questions. Then the question is, at least in part, is there any way of answering them? Nietzsche said, we require at some time new values. Nihilism stands at the door. Whence comes this uncanniest of all guests? Point of departure. It is an error to consider social distress or physiological degeneration or corruption of all things as the cause of nihilism. Now, that's a typical Nietzschean phrase, because there are three profound ideas in that sentence, and each one is in a different phrase. So Nietzsche said at one point, I can write in a sentence what other people write in a book. And then he said, well, what other people can't even write in a book. And this sentence is a good example of that. So what does he say? Well, you know, if you see that people are suffering and in trouble, one thing you can say that is that the reason for that is that the economic system is unjust and they're layered along the bottom, and that's the fundamental cause of their suffering. But Nietzsche doesn't allow that to be an interpretation, a causal interpretation, because he says there are multiple ways of interpreting your position, and mere absence of material luxury does not necessarily destine you to one perspective or another. Physiological degeneration, well, people are unhappy or suffering because they're ill in some manner. Well, you could make that a matter of definition by saying that if you're suffering or unhappy, you are ill, but that's not a causal argument. It's just a different way of categorizing the data. And Nietzsche would reject that, because he would also note that there's some correlation between physiological health and meaning in life, but the correlation doesn't imply causality, and even if it did, the relationship is by no means perfect to the degree that you would want a relationship to be before you accepted it as relevant. Or corruption of all things, well, that would be the idea that being itself is evil, like an evil trick, which is what Tolstoy said, by the way, when he wrote his Confessions. Because Tolstoy, at the height of his intellectual power, he was the most famous novelist in the world and unbelievably well regarded, well, throughout the world, but particularly in Russia. And he was a very, like a socially benevolent man and well regarded for his wisdom. For years he was afraid to go outside with a rope or a gun because he thought he would either hang or shoot himself. And the reason for that was that he had been struck by the idea that life is so unbearable that it should be eradicated. And he couldn't think his way out of that. And it was a form of thought that was actually very characteristic of intellectuals in Russia during his time and in his place. I mean, Dostoevsky wrote about exactly the same sorts of things. But even Tolstoy noted that merely observing that the world was a corrupt and evil place was not necessarily enough to tilt people towards nihilism, because there seemed to be people who weren't nihilistic despite the fact that that seemed self-evident to him. And he thought, Tolstoy actually turned to the Russian people. You know, he was very entranced by the idea of the folk and folk wisdom. And he turned to the Russian people as a source of new inspiration, like the peasantry. And Tolstoy actually fought for the freedom of the peasantry. And he felt that their simple faith, so to speak, was something truly admirable, rather than something pathetic and weak from an intellectual perspective. He strove to emulate that criticismless faith, but of course he couldn't do it, because once you've taken a bite out of the apple, there's no going back, so to speak. Nietzsche says, distress, whether psychic, physical, or intellectual, need not at all produce nihilism. That is, the radical rejection of value, meaning, and desirability. Such distress always permits a variety of interpretations. Rather, it is one particular interpretation, the Christian moral one, that nihilism is rooted. The end of Christianity, at the hands of its own morality, which cannot be replaced, which turns against the Christian God. The sense of truthfulness, highly developed by Christianity, is nauseated by the falseness and mendaciousness of all Christian interpretations of the world and of history. It's a rebound from God is the truth to the equally fanatical faith, all is false, an act of Buddhism. Skepticism regarding morality is what is decisive. The end of the moral interpretation of the world, which no longer has any sanction after it has tried to escape into some beyond, leads to nihilism. All lacks meaning. Well, that's rooted in Nietzsche's criticism of Christianity, because he believed that Christianity was exceptionally morally flawed, because all it offered its followers was the possibility of salvation and redemption from their suffering after they were dead. So it was projected into some other world, which, as far as Nietzsche was concerned, alleviated people of their local responsibility to try to improve things here and now. And Jung's comments about that were essentially that it was the proto-scientists' recognition of the fact that the spiritual salvation that Christianity promised was no longer sufficient that motivated the development of science. So for the early Christians, this is part of the tension between Christianity and science. For the early Christians, the idea was that the earth in some sense was ineradicably corrupt, and that all you could hope for in your earthly life was suffering, and that you should you should accept your suffering and hope for salvation in the future after you're dead. Well, obviously that philosophy appeared insufficient for people, and Jung's hypothesis about the development of science was that a counter fantasy developed in the unconscious of the Europeans, which was that the material realm, which had been defined as evil and therefore not worthy of any study or any pursuit whatsoever, actually held the seeds of the redemption that was lacking. And so that was Jung's commentary on the idea of the philosopher's stone, because the alchemists, who were proto-scientists, were trying to find a material substance, that would be the philosopher's stone, that would offer its holders wealth, health, and eternal life. And so you think, well, why are we pursuing science? Well, hopefully because we think it'll do us some good, here and now, right, in our bodies. And so Jung regarded science itself as stemming from that compensatory dream. It's a brilliant idea. It's actually the only idea I've ever read that seems to do a reasonable psychological account for the emergence of science as a discipline. It's a very strange practice. You know, you have to narrow your interests tremendously to be a scientist. You have to focus on one set of phenomena, you know, that might appear as useless to contemplate as how many angels could dance on the head of a pin. You have to devote decades to the study of that thing to make incremental progress. Why in the world would people ever be motivated to do that? Well, Jung's interpretation was, well, there was a deep counter movement towards the over-spiritualization of the psyche. And that was the revaluation of matter and its possibilities. Well, Nietzsche believed that Christianity, as it stood at the end of the 1800s, was an untenable philosophy, because he thought it had abandoned its moral obligations by escaping into some beyond, and therefore damned life as it was actually lived by human beings. So he felt that the demise was a good thing. He points out one other thing, and this is the difference between having a theory and then learning to theorize. He says, look, if you've been raised in a tradition, whatever that tradition happens to be, you have a belief system, whatever that belief system happens to be, and it falls apart on you at any one point, you suffer for two reasons. The first is, your belief system fell apart. And that's not a good thing. It leaves everything unfixed and open, and you drown in possibility, in a sense. That's a Kierkegaardian phrase. But the second consequence is even worse. Once you've learned that one belief system that's solid could be demolished and fall apart, then it's very difficult ever again to have any faith in any belief systems whatsoever. So not only do you become a doubter of your own creed, let's say, you become a meta-doubter, which is the doubter of all belief systems. Well, in the step from that to nihilism, maybe those are exactly the same thing. You know, and that's really, you could think about that in some sense as the disease of the critical rational mind. It can saw off any branch that it's sitting on. And, you know, the utility of that is leave no stone unturned, right? You're supposed to question things, and the utility of that is you learn new things. But the price you pay for it is that you're not necessarily ever certain about anything. And, you know, you could say, well, maybe you shouldn't be certain about anything, but you can forget that. You know, you're going to have to act as if you're certain many times in your life. For when you choose a permanent mate, for example, if you do that, which you probably will because you're university educated, and university educated people still do that, although no one else does. So, and you're going to pick a career, and you're going to make decisions one after the other, about which, if you're not certain, you can't make, in which case you have no life. You're just a whirlwind of chaos. So you're stuck with the necessity of following a course of action, which is acted out certainty, that your intellect cannot regard as appropriate. And that's hard on people. Why should I choose this instead of this? Why should I act this way instead of that way? You know, I don't know is not a very useful answer when you're a creature that's as cognitively able as we are.
And why beholdest thou the mote that is in thy brother's eye, but considerest not the beam that is in thine own eye? Or how will you say to thy brother, let me pull out the mote out of thine eye, and behold, a beam is in thine own eye? Well, you might be wondering what a beam is, and a mote is a dust speck, and a beam is a very large piece of lumber. And so the issue is,
Not so much the blindness of others, even though there's as much blindness among others as there is for you. But the issue here, the advice here, the description here is, you should be concerned about what's interfering with your own vision first. And you should leave other people the hell alone in relationship to that. And so if your mode of being in the world is, if you would just act better, things would improve for me, or if you identify the evil and the catastrophe as something that's outside, that someone else needs to fix, or that someone else is responsible for, then you're not going to fix that. And you're going to remain blind to the things that you're doing and not doing that make things not go well. And so it's just better to think, all right, I'm probably blind in many, many ways. And maybe there are some ways that I could rectify that, because it's highly probable that you're blind in all sorts of ways. I mean, in fact, it's virtually certain. And so it's just more useful to think, how is it that I'm wrong in this situation? I'll tell you something that I learned to do when I was arguing with my wife, which happened quite frequently, because when you actually communicate with people, you find out that there's many things that you don't agree on. And that's because you're actually different creatures. And so if you're actually going to have a truthful conversation, then you're going to find out that you don't see things the same way, and then you can either pretend that that's not the case and gloss over it and then end up in a 30-year silent war, or you can have the damn fight when you need to have it and see if you can straighten it out. So now and then we'd get in a situation where we were at loggerheads, we couldn't move. And, you know, it would spiral up into hate speech, let's say. Because, yeah, everyone laughs because they know they manifest plenty of hate speech towards those they love. So one of the things we learned to do was, when we hit an impasse, was to separate and to go our own ways and to go sit and think, okay, look, we're at this unpleasant situation. We can't figure out how to move forward. I'd always think, of course it's her fault. Obviously it's her fault. At least 95%. But maybe there was something I did that contributed like 5% to it. And so I would sit and think and ask myself a question, which was, is there anything I did in the last 6 months that increased the probability that this impasse would manifest itself? And I'll tell you, you have no idea how fast your mind will generate an answer to a question like that. Because there's undoubtedly some idiotic thing that you did, that you know, that you remember, that increased the probability that you're going to have your hands around the throat of the person that you love. And then you can go tell them that. And then you can have a conversation, especially if they do the same thing. Say, look, you know, here's how I'm an idiot in this situation. And the other person says, well, yeah, here's how I'm an idiot. And then you're two idiots, and then maybe you can have a conversation. So, thou hypocrite, first cast out the beam of out of thine own eye, and then shalt thou see clearly to cast out the mote of thy brother's eye. That's, hey, hard to argue with that. Ask, and it shall be given you. Seek, and ye shall find. Knock, and it shall be opened unto you. For everyone that asketh receiveth, and he that seeketh findeth, and to him that knocketh it shall be opened. That sounded pretty optimistic again. But again, I think it's a description of the structure of existential reality. And by which I mean, when I'm in my clinical practice and I observe, and this is also the case with my students, is, let's say, people's lives aren't what they would like them to be. And so then you ask, why? Well, forget about tragedy and catastrophe, because that's self-evident, and we're not going to discuss that. Although the degree to which you bring about your own tragedy is always indeterminate. But I would never say that every terrible thing that is visited on a person is something they deserved. I think that that's a very dangerous presupposition, especially because everyone gets sick and everyone dies. But one of the main reasons that people don't get what they want is because they don't actually figure out what it is. And the probability that you're going to get what would be good for you, let's say, which would even be better than what you want, right? Because, you know, you might be wrong about what you want easily. But maybe you could get what would really be good for you.
Well, why don't you? Well, because you don't try. You don't think, okay, here's what I would like if I could have it. And I don't mean in a way that you manipulate the world to force it to deliver you goods for status or something like that. That isn't what I mean. I mean something like, imagine that you were taking care of yourself like you were someone you actually cared for. And then you thought, okay, I'm caring for this person. I would like things to go as well for them as possible. What would their life have to be like in order for that to be the case? Well, people don't do that. They don't sit down and think, all right, you know, let's figure it out. You've got a life. It's hard, obviously. It's like 3 years from now, you can have what you need. You've got to be careful about it. You can't have everything. You can have what would be good for you, but you have to figure out what it is, and then you have to aim at it. Well, my experience with people has been if they figure out what it is that would be good for them, and then they aim at it, then they get it. And it's strange because they don't it's a strange thing. It's not quite that simple because, you know, you may formulate an idea about what would be good for you, and then you take 10 steps towards that, and you find out that your formulation was a bit off, and so you have to reformulate your goal. You know, so you're kind of going like this as you move towards the goal. But a huge part of the reason that people fail is because they don't ever set up the criteria for success. And so, since success is a very narrow line and very unlikely, the probability that you're going to stumble on it randomly is 0. And so there's a proposition here, and the proposition is, if you actually want something, you can have it. Now the question then would be, well, what do you mean by actually want? And the answer is that you reorient your life in every possible way to make the probability that that will occur as certain as possible. And that's a sacrificial idea, right? It's like, you don't get everything. Obviously. But maybe you can have what you need. And maybe all you have to do to get it is ask. But the asking isn't a whim or today's wish. It's like, you have to be deadly serious about it. You have to think, okay, like, I'm taking stock of myself. And if I was going to live properly in the world, and I was going to set myself up such that being would justify itself in my estimation, and I don't mean as a harsh judge, exactly what is it that I would aim at? Well, one of the things I've found is that in test of this theory, let's say, you could try this. This is a form of prayer, knocking. Sit on your bed one day and ask yourself, what remarkably stupid things am I doing on a regular basis to absolutely screw up my life? And if you actually ask that question, but you have to want to know the answer, right? Because that's actually what asking the question means. It doesn't mean just mouthing the words. It means you have to decide that you want to know. You'll figure that's out so fast it'll make your hair curl. It's as if Jung thought about this. He thought that people had 2 poles of consciousness, and one was the individual consciousness that we each identify with, and the other was something he called the self, and the self is you might think about it as the divine within. That's a close enough approximation. It's the universal part of your consciousness. It's your conscience. That's another way of thinking about it, whatever your conscience is. But it's something that you can consult. It's like the Socratic daemon. Socrates said that the thing that made him different than everyone else in Greece was that he consulted his daemon, his genius. He asked himself how it was that he should conduct himself in the world, and then he did that, whatever it was. He didn't try to force a solution, he didn't try to force a solution selfishly. He asked, I'm going to manifest myself in the best possible manner in the world. I would like to do that. What would that be? Well, you're perfectly capable of thinking. God only knows how. You're perfectly capable of immense feats of imagination and dream and fantasy. God only knows how you do all of that. What would happen if you consulted yourself about the best possible outcome for you? You might get an answer. Well, that's what this proposition is. It's funny that philosopher Kierkegaard, you don't usually hear a joke that starts like that, by the way. He wrote 150 years ago, and he was one of the first people who really wrote about anxiety. He was one of the first psychological philosophers. And
he regarded himself as rather useless, all things considered. And he wrote a section in one of his books about all the industrialists that were operating in Europe at that time, trying in every possible way to make life easier and easier and more efficient and productive for everyone, which was definitely happening during the Victorian period, and Europe was rapidly transforming into an industrial powerhouse. And he said, someone as useless as him, with an orientation towards being a student who liked to sit and contemplate ideas and talk in cafes and smoke cigars and drink, could never do anything to make anything easier for anyone than everyone was already trying to make it. And so he thought that his task would be to make things more difficult for people, because there would come a time when what people wanted wasn't more ease, but more challenge and more difficulty. And that's really smart, you know, and it's witty and it's true. And one of the things that I've come to understand, I believe, is that, and Dostoevsky knew this too. He wrote about this in Notes from Underground. It's a great book, very short book, brilliant, absolutely brilliant, compelling, dark read. It's the confession of a miserable, resentful, like murderously genocidal bureaucrat who evaluates his own soul, I suppose, and confesses his sins. And it's also a critique of the idea of kind of utopia oriented towards security. And Dostoevsky, who was dealing with the set of ideas that are really tearing us apart culturally right now, this idea of a eventual utopia based on something like security and safety. Dostoevsky really objected to that back in this, like 1860, a long time ago. He said, you know, the thing about people that you don't really understand is that, he said, fundamentally we're ungrateful and we can curse. That's what distinguished us from the animals, which I thought was pretty damn comical. But he said something very interesting, you know. He said, if you set up a utopia so that all people had to do was eat cakes and busy themselves with the continuation of the species, that, yeah, right, Russian humor, you know, that after a surfeit of that, after enough of that, which would happen quite quickly, people would just go mad just to break things, just so something unexpected and remarkable could happen, and that we're not built for security and safety, but for something, well, let's call it adventure, something like adventure. That's a good thing to know, you know, because you don't want to suffer unduly. That seems reasonable. And you might think, because of that, that really what you want is happiness. But then Solzhenitsyn, for example, he wrote about what happened in the Gulag Archipelago under Stalin and said, you know, if your goal is happiness, what are you going to do when the jackboots hammer down your door at 2 a.m. and haul you off to the prison camp, because you're not going to be happy there. And so, you know, happiness is a boat that's easily capsized and the waves are always there. And so if your philosophy is one of, say, impulsive happiness, same sort of thing Dostoevsky was pointing at, and Kierkegaard, then you're not prepared when all hell breaks loose. And all hell, it will absolutely 100% break through at some point in your life. And you're lucky if it won't be decades, you know, it'll certainly be some of it, and it might be a lot of it. And for some of you, it's going to be damn near the whole thing. And so if what floats your boat is happiness, you're going to be capsized by the first decent wave. And so then you might ask yourself, you know, what do you have instead of happiness that might be even more reliable? And I do think that adventure is more reliable than happiness. And in the Old Testament story of Abraham, founder of the Abrahamic faiths, and obviously what would you call it, a crucial figure in the development of world culture, Abraham is presented as a late bloomer, to say the least. He's like 83. People lived longer back then, at least so the story goes. And he had a very rich father by nomadic standards, and he could just sit around in the tent all day. And, you know, a doting mother and a rich father, he could just sit around in the tent all day and eat peeled grapes and busy himself with the continuation of the species. And But, you know, God appears to him and says, get away, get out of your security, get out of your comfort. Leave your family, leave your community, leave your nation, go out into the world. And it's very interesting. It's a very interesting story. It's very interesting to contemplate it from both a psychological and a religious perspective, because what God is presented as in that book, which is a crucial book for as I said, for world culture, is God is presented as the manifestation of the Spirit that calls even the too secure and pampered to adventure. And then Abraham has a pretty rough time when he goes out and has his adventure. It's not all, you know, Skittles and roses from then on in. Quite the contrary. And he runs right away into like a conspiracy of elites to steal his wife. He runs into tyranny, runs into starvation. He encounters war. It's like he goes out in the world and he has the whole tragedy of his life, both on the social and political front and individually, you know. But the promise is the promise of adventure, and the implication is that if you have a sufficient adventure, then that cannot so much protect you from suffering, because perhaps that is impossible, but to justify it. And because you kind of know this in your own life. When you look at your life, you might look back on travails that you've undertaken, you know, and they've done end-of-life surveys with people and asked them what they regret. And, you know, people don't regret what they did that didn't work. They regret what they didn't do that could have worked. You know, they regret the chances they didn't take. And, you know, even if you do an evaluation of your biography, one of the things that you want to be able to say to yourself is something like, maybe there's nothing better you can say to yourself than this. You can think about this for yourself and see if it's true. That was extraordinarily difficult, but it was worth it. And, you know, it's not like you can have one of those without the other, because you can't imagine that you could have some confidence in what you've managed to accomplish, right? The kind of confidence that would instill you with a certain genuine sense of self-regard despite your fundamental inadequacy. To have that fundamental sense of self-regard that's grounded in something real, it has to be based in a narrative that approximates that was extremely difficult, but it was worth it. You have to have both of those. And so that's interesting, because one of the questions we always ask ourselves, this is the theodicy question, technically. You see the suffering in the world, you see the suffering of children, you see maybe your own children or your suffering, and you wonder, well, how can reality be constituted so that I can have faith in its essence when there is so much suffering? And one answer to that is something like, well, how much suffering do you want? And you might think, none. It's like, yeah, I don't think so. I don't think that's right. At least you want something approximating optimized challenge. So you could say, at least you want to be pushed to your limit. And maybe you find the most exciting times in your life. In fact, you'll pay for this. You'll pay to have this experience, to be pushed to your limit. Like, not beyond it, or maybe even a bit beyond it, you know. And maybe not so far beyond it that you crumble and break and things fall apart. But, you know, could you be pushed to your limit optimally if there wasn't the possibility of falling apart and breaking? Like, that's an open question. How are you ever going to take something seriously if the consequences aren't actually serious? You know, and there's something delightful about dancing on the edge. That's why Hawaiians believed that surfing was sacred, you know, and it's because to surf you have to be on the edge, right? And the waves can come and take you out at any moment. But without the possibility of the waves rising to take you out, then you can't dance on the edge. And maybe that's exactly what you want to do, you know. And there's good evidence from the neuroscience literature that consciousness itself is something akin to dancing on the edge. So technically, when you're conscious, when you're awake, your brain is occupying a position between something. It's a position that's something like between chaos and order. And if your brain's maximally ordered, well, you're just bored, nothing is changing. And if you're chaotic, then it's anxiety and catastrophe. But you want to be positioned right between those two, and that's when your consciousness is optimized, you know. And when your consciousness is optimized, then you're deeply engaged in life, and everything seems alive and meaningful. And maybe that's the solution in some profound sense to the problem of suffering. It's that you optimize your interaction with chaos rather than being protected all the time from everything that could hurt you. And you kind of know this too if you have kids, because you don't want to keep your kids in an infantile state, and because when they're infants, pretty much what you do with them, say they're 6 months and younger, is you just keep them secure and safe, right? You just provide everything that you can for them. You have to do that because, well, what are they going to do? They just lay there fundamentally and squawk now and then. I mean, it's not like they're ambulatory. They can't go out and do things for themselves, and so it's up to you, and your goal is to keep them secure and safe. But once they start being able to move around, then increasingly it's sort of up to them. And if you have any sense as a parent, the psychoanalysts used to say, the good mother necessarily fails. And what did they mean by that? They meant, well, you know, if you're committed to your infant when you're a mother, for the first 6 months, it's like it's all the kid, 100%, full self-sacrifice devoted towards the infant. That's the right attitude. But even by 9 months, child can crawl around quite a lot. They're developing something of an independent will. You start handing them challenges. You start handing them responsibility, and you keep them on the edge. And some of your kids are going to be able to be pushed harder than others, and part of the reason you have to develop a relationship with your kids, and your husband for that matter, is so that, you know, you can keep them dancing on the edge, on the proper edge. And that's even better than the mere provision of security.
Victim, which is a painful role to have, because something bad happened to you, be a victim. Mm-hmm. But it's something that society struggles with. What about people who feel like they're a victim?
They're right. They're victimizers too. Like, everybody is a strange mixture of victim and victimizer. Lots of terrible things happen to people that aren't justifiable in some sense. You know, well, illness strikes people randomly. I mean, not entirely randomly, obviously, but there's a large random element in it. Where you're thrown into existence as a consequence of your birth. That's existentialists, especially in the 1950s, talked about that all the time. They talked about it as thrownness, that you're sort of thrown into reality with your particular set of predispositions and weaknesses. And then there's going to be times in your life where things twist in a manner that's unfair to you, that you're not getting your just desserts. But that goes along with all sorts of unequally distributed privileges as well. And so that's the arbitrary nature of existence. But you can't allow those sorts of things to define you, because it's not that useful strategically. When you're playing a card game, you're dealt a hand of cards. Well, what do? You play that hand the best you can. Why? Because all the hands are equal? No. Because you don't have a better strategy than playing the hand that you're dealt the best you can. And that doesn't even mean it'll be a winning strategy. But because people don't always win, sometimes we lose, and sometimes we lose painfully, and sometimes we lose painfully and unjustly. That's not the point. The point is you don't have a better strategy, and neither does anyone else. And then it's also not so obvious how privilege and victimization are distributed. You know, if you take someone who's doing quite well in life, and you scratch underneath the surface, you generally don't have to scratch very far until you find one or more profound tragedies of the past, or perhaps of the present. Now, no matter how well protected you are in the world, you're still subject to illness, you're still subject to aging, you're still subject to the dissolution of your relationships, the death of your dreams, death itself. So vulnerability is built into the structure of existence. Now, if you start to regard yourself as a hapless victim, or even worse, an unfairly victimized victim, well, then things go very badly sideways for you. It's not a good strategy. You end up resentful, you end up angry, you end up vengeful, you end up hostile. And that's just the beginning. Things can get far more out of hand than that. So strategically, it's a bad game. It's better to take responsibility for the hand that you've been dealt. You've got no better protection in life than
You know, if you take people, then you expose them voluntarily to things that they are avoiding and are afraid of, you know, that they know they need to overcome in order to meet their goals, their self-defined goals. If you can teach people to stand up in the face of the things they're afraid of, they get stronger. And you don't know what the upper limits to that are, because you might ask yourself, like, if for 10 years, if you didn't avoid doing what you knew you needed to do, what would you be like? Well, you know, there are remarkable people who come into the world from time to time, and there are people who do find out over decades-long periods what they could be like if they were who they were, if they spoke their being forward. And they get stronger and stronger and stronger, and we don't know the limits to that. We do not know the limits to that. Probably running at about 51% of our capacity. Something, I mean, you can think about this yourselves. I often ask undergraduates how many hours a day you waste, or how many hours a week you waste. And the classic answer is something like 4 to 6 hours a day. You know, inefficient studying, watching things on YouTube that not only do you not want to watch, that you don't even care about, that make you feel horrible about watching after you're done. That's probably 4 hours right there. You know, you think, well, that's 25 hours a week. It's 100 hours a month. That's 2.5 full work weeks. It's half a year of work weeks per year. And so if your life isn't everything it could be, you could ask yourself, well, what would happen if you just stopped wasting the opportunities that are in front of you? You'd be, who knows how much more efficient? 10 times more efficient, 20 times more efficient. That's the Pareto distribution. You have no idea how efficient people get. It's it's off the charts. It's not so obvious to me that people would take the meaningful path. You know, when you say, well, nihilists suffer dreadfully because there's no meaning in their life and they still suffer, yeah, but the advantage is they have no responsibility. So that's the payoff, and I actually think that's the motivation. Say, well, I can't help being nihilistic. All my belief systems have collapsed. It's like, yeah, maybe. Maybe you've just allowed them to collapse because it's a hell of a lot easier than acting them out. And the price you pay is some meaningless suffering. But you can always whine about that, and people will feel sorry for you. If you live a pathological life, you pathologize your society. And if enough people do that, then it's hell. Really, really.
One of the things that you can, I think this heightens the meaning in your life, is to try to do difficult things, right? Aim high. Don't aim so damn high you can't manage it, and make sure you break down your aims into reasonably attainable sub-goals, but you want to aim high, and then you want to see how hyper-efficient you can get. That's a great thing to do in your early 20s, is to see, okay, like, discipline yourself. Think, okay, how much work can I do if I load myself right to the maximum? How far can I work? How hard can I work until I exhaust myself? And then you back off, obviously, because the optimal amount of working, productive engagement, let's say, is that which is sustainable across decades. So you have to learn that, but you don't learn that without stretching yourself to your limits to begin with. And you know, if your life isn't everything it could be, and if you're suffering from an excess of meaninglessness, well, it means you're not oriented in the world of chaos and order properly. It's like you could learn to discipline yourself. Look, figure out what it is that you need to do and that you want to do, and then see how efficient you can get. Because one of the things that's quite fun is to figure out, if you have a task, I always tell my graduate students this if they're doing an experiment too. If you have a task that you have to do, it's really interesting to spend a few minutes, sometimes hours, depending on how long the task is. See if you can figure out how to do it from 5 to 10 times faster. It means you'll have to rearrange the way you think about it, but you can often do it. And that's how extremely productive people get so hyper efficient.
If you're suffering, you are obligated, in a sense, to hold on to whatever rope someone throws you. Life can be meaningful enough to justify its suffering. You can tyrannize yourself into doing things, but I wouldn't recommend it. What I would recommend instead is that you ask yourself what you're willing to do. It's a really effective technique. It's like a meditative technique. That's when life is worthwhile. I don't know exactly what's going to help you, but don't arbitrarily throw out any possibilities because you might not have that luxury. Antidepressants help a lot of people, and there are technical reasons why that's the case. If you're offered a gift by your society and it works, try it. I don't care what your presuppositions are. The time you see people who are suffering, with depression, for example. There's a multitude of reasons, but I'll take one common reason. You could think about it as associated with the story of Peter Pan. Peter Pan is someone who won't grow up, right? Now the problem with Peter Pan is he gets to be king, but it's king of Neverland. Neverland doesn't exist. So being king of nothing isn't that helpful. Well, one of the things that you often see with people who suffer from depression, and I'm not making a blanket statement about the cause of depression because there's lots of them, is that people who don't have enough order in their life tend to get overwhelmed. So for example, if someone comes into me to see me and they say they're depressed, I always ask them a very standard set of questions. Do you have a job? If you don't have a job, you're really in trouble in our society. First of all, your biological rhythms tend to go off the rails right away because there's no reason to go to bed at any particular time and there's no reason to get up. And for many people, if they don't get up at the same time, they foul up the functioning of their circadian rhythms, and that's enough to make them depressed right off the bat, especially if they start napping during the afternoon. They also don't have a purpose. People aren't good without a purpose, and this isn't hypothesizing. We absolutely understand the circuitry that underlies positive emotion. When you're attending to something you're interested in and you're engaged in it, that's when you're alive. That's when life is worthwhile. It's so worthwhile that in those moments you don't even ask the question about it. The question itself goes away because the meaning that you're united with is so powerful that it can push back the adversity that would otherwise characterize life. Nietzsche said, the person who has a why can bear any how. We know how it works. Almost all the positive emotion that any of you are likely to experience in your life will not be a consequence of attaining things. It will be a consequence of seeing that things are working as you proceed towards a goal you value. That's completely different. And you need to know this because people are often stunned, for example. They finish their PhD thesis and their presupposition is that they're going to be elated for a month. And often instead they're actually depressed. And they think, oh, what the hell, I've been working on this for 7 years and I handed it in and what do I do now? And that's what depresses them, right? It's the what do I do now? Well, they're fine if they enjoyed it pursuing the thing. As long as it was working out, they get a lot of enthusiasm and excitement out of that because that's how our nervous systems work. Most of your positive emotion is goal pursuit emotion. If you take drugs like cocaine or amphetamine, the reason they're enjoyable is because they turn on the systems that help you pursue goals. That's why people like them. So if you don't have a job, you got no structure, that's not good. Plus, you tend not to have a point. So you're overwhelmed by chaotic lack of structure and you don't have any positive emotion.
So that's an interesting thing. Well, so let's say you go over your past with a fine-tooth comb and you decide you're going to take responsibility for everything that you did that was wrong and everything that you failed to do that you could have done that was right. It's like, does that change the world? It's like, depends on how thoroughly you do it. You might say it changes the world like nothing else possibly can. And I think that that's actually right. You have to allow yourself a certain latitude for error. And that's a useful thing to know too. One of the things I tell people when they're trying to develop a vision for their life or an implementable plan is make a bad plan. Like, make the best one you can, but don't get obsessive about it. It's like, make a plan, implement it. You'll figure out when you implement it why it's stupid. Exactly. And then you can fix it a little bit.
So imagine you have a goal in mind. You want to get to work in the morning. I used to ask my students a question like this, is like, what? Maybe they're going to write an essay. Why are you writing the essay? Why are you in class? Well, I'm in class because I need this class because it's part of my major. Well, why did you pick a major like that? Well, I'm interested in psychology. Well, why did you come to get a degree? Well, I think I need a degree to get a job. Well, why do you need a job? Well, I need a job to keep body and soul together and maybe to be productive and maybe to, establish a name for myself. And why do you want to do that? Well, because, it's part and parcel of living properly. And why do you want to live properly? And well then, and how would you live if you lived properly? And at that point, people are usually unable to answer. Because you can just push people with questions about why until they run out of explanations. But the point is that you're always doing whatever you're doing because what you're doing is nested in a sequence of goal-directed actions. And those can be more or less sophisticated. If you're not very sophisticated at all, the nesting might be like two structures deep. You know, maybe you're, I don't know, you're bored and you want to go get drunk, you know, and why? Well, because you don't want to be bored. And if someone pushes you a little farther than that, you hit them. And, you know, you don't want to delve into it. But if you're sophisticated, you have a pretty good hierarchy of answers. So you might say, well, why do you want to be a productive and generous citizen? And like I said, people usually bottom out there. But you could say, well, that's part of reciprocal altruism. And if I'm productive and generous, then that'll encourage other people to be productive and generous. And if we're all productive and generous together, then there'll be more for everyone, and we'll all get along better, and we'll get along for a longer period of time, and that'll make us all more stable, and that'll make our societies better. And then you might say, well, why is that relevant? You might say, well, because the alternative to that is something like a descent into something approximating hell, and so that's part of a reflection of the divine order and the eternal battle between good and evil. And then you could push it farther than that, and you could say, well, are you going to be on the side of the redemptive hero, or are you going to be on the side of the eternal adversary? Like, you can keep digging down farther and farther, and the farther down you dig, the more you get down into what you might describe as the implicit religious substrate. And it's very much useful to know that and to make as much of that conscious as possible. So now imagine that you've come to this talk tonight because you've decided to aim up. And maybe you haven't formulated that precisely explicitly, but something is driving you in this direction. And then you come to the talk and you find out that I'm talking about something that isn't what you expected, and it doesn't seem to be moving you along on your pathway forward to that end. And what's going to happen is you're going to be disappointed. And you might be anxious too. You're going to be disappointed because disappointment signals that you're experiencing something that's not relevant to the goal that you are attempting to pursue, and that might in fact be interfering with it. That's what negative emotion does. And maybe if you're disappointed in what I say, that also makes you anxious because you assumed that you would come here and I would say something relevant, because you assumed that you knew who I was, and then it turned out that I didn't, and then you don't know who I am, and then you don't know what you're doing here, and then you get anxious. And the reason you get anxious is because that's what anxiety is for. It tells you when the pathway to your goal has been disrupted, so multiple pathways have now emerged. So imagine you're driving your car to work and it quits. And what happens is you get anxious. And the reason you get anxious is because, well, you were beetling along quite nicely in your world, and everything was reduced to like a unidimensional simplicity. You weren't in a car as an object, you were in a thing that took you to where you wanted to go, and it was just doing what it was supposed to be doing, tracking you along the pathway to your goal. And then it fails and you're off on the side of the road, and you get anxious because how the hell are you going to get to work? And what if you don't get to work? And is your boss not going to be very happy with you? And maybe this is the third mistake you've made this week. And what if you get fired? And weren't you an idiot for buying this car? Maybe you shouldn't have a car at all. Maybe you should have walked to work. And, you know, maybe you should take a bicycle, because after all, that would save the planet. And, you know, and maybe now you have to take your car to a mechanic, but the last time you went to the mechanic, you got ripped off because you're too stupid about vehicles to manage one, and you're kind of stupid about technology in general. And aren't you stupid? And maybe you're too stupid, and isn't your wife going to? That's anxiety, right? And that's the emergence of a multiplicity of pathways, right? And so what anxiety signifies is the degeneration of an attentional hierarchy into multiplicity. And the reason you get anxious and it feels bad is because now your body can't compute how much energy you have to put out in order to get to your goal. And so you can't organize the world. You're apt to use more resources than you'll replenish. And if you continue to do that, then you'll die. And so anxiety is a signal that complexity has reemerged, chaos. That's the eternal dragon of chaos. Chaos has reemerged because your narrative has collapsed. And so that's negative emotion. That's what negative emotion signifies, is that it's the collapse of an organizing narrative. And so that's very interesting to know. So you feel positive. If I walk on the stage and I know I'm supposed to go to the front of the stage, say, and the reason I want to do that is because I know I have to talk to you, and that's and I want to talk to you because I think it's valuable to talk to you, etc. That's nested in a hierarchy of value. And if I see a clear pathway to the front of the stage, then that actually produces positive emotion. And that positive emotion impels me forward, because positive emotion does impel you forward. That's what it's for. That's how positive emotion is linked to action. So if you're enthusiastic because you can see a pathway forward to a valued goal, and that enthusiasm manifests itself. This is true even neurochemically. It manifests itself as positive motivation to move forward. And not only that, if you're moving forward and it's working, your brain tracks the fact that it's working, and then that's linked to dopamine release, by the way, which is what cocaine releases. It's linked to dopamine release. And the other thing your brain is doing, even when you're just walking to where you want to go, if you're successfully walking there, your brain tracks what you're doing. There's circuits that are activated while you're doing it. And if what you're doing results in the result you desired, then the dopamine floods those little neurons that are active, and it makes them grow and flourish. And so as you practice something that's working, the circuit that is activated as you're practicing is bathed in dopamine, and that makes it stronger. And that feels good. It's growth. It's part of positive emotion. And so the positive emotion moves you forward, but also encourages you to develop a habit of that practice. And so one of the things I would bloody well say is, don't make a habit of pursuing things that aren't good for you, because you build that into you. That's what happens if you become addicted to something, you know. You build a little monster inside you that's grown. It's there. It's after one goal, despite everything else. Not a good outcome. So now positive emotion also signals the fact that it's also an energy conservation observation. So as I move forward towards my goal, with each step I take, it's going to take less energy to get to the goal. And so that means that the positive emotion signifies, what would you say? It signifies the increasing efficiency of your action as you move towards a goal. So negative emotion signifies the fact that things have got too complex for you to manage, and positive emotion signifies that you're approaching your goal and becoming, and that there's less demand on energy output with every step forward. And so that's emotion. And that's pretty much worth knowing. And then what happens when you're watching a movie is you infer the goal of the protagonist, or the villain for that matter. You infer the goal of the character that's being portrayed on the screen. You adopt that goal as your own. Then you play out the emotions in your own body, which mimics the structure what would you call the character that's being portrayed on the screen, and you live that all out inside you. And that's also how you understand other people, right? You don't listen to someone and then figure out what they're saying and then infer what they're thinking. That isn't how it works. What you do is you listen to someone till you figure out what they're up to. As soon as you figure out what they're up to, you can adopt that frame of reference. As soon as you adopt that frame of reference, you have the same emotions. And that's what makes you united. And so that's so interesting. And so then you think, look, there's 5,000 people in here. If there were 5,000 chimpanzees, you guys would be tearing each other into shreds, because no one would be able to know what anyone else was up to. But because all of you are here paying attention to the same thing in the same way, you have virtually identical emotional states, and that means instantly your behavior is rendered predictable to one another. And there's no difference between that and peace. They're the same thing. And so what that means is that one of the predicates of a civil, productive, and peaceful society is that everyone inhabits the same narrative. And you might say, well, we don't need the same narrative. It's like, yes, we do, because if we inhabit a different narrative, then we're running emotionally in different directions, and we will not understand each other, and we will run into conflict, and that conflict can become deadly at the drop of a hat. And so it's a precondition for a civil society that everyone is united in the same narrative. And then that begs the question, right? What is the narrative insofar as we're unified? And another question, which is, what should the narrative be? Right? Now, the postmodernists figured out that we looked at the world through a story, but they said their mantra is they became skeptical of meta-narratives, which are uniting narratives. And that's all well and good to be skeptical about meta-narratives, but you run into the problem of internal disunion, because if you don't have a uniting narrative, then you're divided against yourself, and you run into the problem of social disunity, because if we're not looking at the same thing for the same reason, then we can't get along. And those are big problems. Now, the way the postmodernists glided over that immense cataclysmic problem was to offer the proposition that the narrative that unites us is just one of power and oppression, right? And that the fundamental motivation that guides, first of all, even your internal organization, your own internal tyranny, you know, you're oppressing your id or your natural self. And then if you establish a relationship with someone like a marriage, well, that's just a manifestation of patriarchal oppression. And if you organize a business relationship, it's a relationship of mutual exploitation, and so far and so on, all the way up the political hierarchy, all the way back into the past. A more dismal view of human existence couldn't possibly be formulated. And I always think about it as a kind of implicit confession. It's like, so you think the world's all run by power, do you? Okay, I know what game you're playing and attempting to justify, and it's completely bloody preposterous, because first of all, if you tyrannize yourself, you're going to be one miserable creature. Plus, you're going to rebel constantly, as you already know. I'm sure all of you have tried at one time or another in your life to force yourself to do something with a whip, so to speak, and what you instantly find is that you're so condemned to be free that you'll even resist your own tyranny, right? Try telling yourself to do something and see if you do it. I'm going to go to the gym. That's New Year's. I'm going to the gym 3 times a week, 2 hours a day. It's like, no, you're not. You're going to last like 3 days. And then you're going to find an excuse. The rebellious part of you is going to find an excuse, then you're not going to do it. And it's a bloody mystery, isn't it? Because you'd think you could tell yourself what to do. Because otherwise, who are you, you know? You're the part that told yourself what to do, but you don't listen, so what the hell's that part? That's you, that's for sure. So you can't even tyrannize yourself with any efficiency. And then if you're married, men, you're married, try tyrannizing your wife and see how well that works. And like, it might work for 10 minutes, but she's not as big as you, but she's a lot sneakier. And you have to wake up with her tomorrow morning. And so even if you do win the fight, which you won't, she's going to bloody well take it out on you the next day, and no wonder. And so you're bound in that relationship by the necessity of continual iterative interactions, right? And they have to be moderately peaceful, or you're going to tear each other into shreds. And if it's constant conflict, you're both going to just exhaust yourself and die. So how the hell is that going to work? So it has to be at least mutually reinforcing. And maybe if you really got it together well, you could interact with each other in a way that improved your interactions across time. And maybe you're wise enough so that if you were on that track, the way you would experience that in the moment would be as exactly the kind of relationship you'd want to have with someone. And that would be something like the spirit of play and romantic love. And that would be the manifestation of an instinct that orients you across time properly in a relationship in the moment. And that's such a wonderful thing to know, right? That instinct for play and romantic love might be the voice of the wisest instinct you have, the deepest orientation to meaning that you have. You know, because there's nothing more delightful in a marriage or in a family, if you have children, than to be able to engage in something like voluntary play. And you know, if you could have the world set up the way you would want it to, if you had any sense, wouldn't it be something if mostly what you did was something akin to play? And that's equivalent. Christ in the gospel says Know that unless you become like a little child, you'll never enter the kingdom of heaven. And what does that mean? It means to rediscover that intense immersion in life and that capacity for play that characterized us all as children that we can't maintain because we have to mature, but that we could rediscover as adults if we were sufficiently wise and careful. And so, and then, you know, if you have friends, it's like, well, you tyrannize your friends? Well, then you don't have friends. You're just a bully with henchmen. And as soon as you stumble, they're going to stab you in the back because you surrounded yourself with craven psychopaths. And they're just going to wait for the moment to take you out. That's not a friendship, obviously. And if you're running a business, and those of you who've run businesses who have a clue know this is true, it's like, what happens if you rip off your customers? Well, you can get away with it once or twice, but word gets around in no time flat, and then you're just done and bitter and resentful because your idiot machinations didn't work. But if you engage in fair trade and you're reliable and you deliver what you promised and you're half decently good to your employees and the people that you work for, then they're going to be pleased with you, and they're going to come back and they're going to talk to their friends about how well you did, and you're going to flourish. And none of that's arbitrary. You know, that's all guided by the manifestation of a certain form of attentional priority, right? You go to your customer's house, maybe you're a plumber, and the first thing you do is you listen to their damn problem. And so at least you have enough sense to engage in dialogos, right? You actually want to hear what the problem is, and then you actually want to solve it. And if you do that with some diligence, they're going to be pleased with you because they don't want sewage all over the rug. And so your interests are aligned, and if you offer what you promise, then you're going to evoke positive emotion in them and quell their anxiety, and that's exactly the service that you're offering. And so that means you're acting out the proper story. You're productive and generous and honest, and there's nothing arbitrary about that as a ethos that unites you internally and that also makes it possible for you to exist in a peaceful and productive society.
If you encounter an entity and you can map it at every single level of your value hierarchy, then it's known. You know how to interact with it at a micro level, and you know what its implications are for every other level of your conceptual being. You know what its implications are for the future. Like, you know exactly how to deal with that thing. It's mapped at every single level. There's other things that are only mapped at one level and not at others. So maybe, you know, you like the mouse, we'll say, for the child who's never seen a mouse, it's like it shares some commonalities with objects that the child is familiar with. But there's sufficient novelty so that it's also contaminated with the unknown. And that makes the child basically alert, semi-startled and alert. Now, the child will immediately refer to an adult. It's a technical term, actually. They'll look at the adult's face because the adult's face will broadcast the motivational and affective significance of that event. And so the child looks, references, and then reads off the face, and of course the speech and the bodily actions, exactly what that thing signifies, you know. And then if the person that they're looking at jumps up on the table and screams, then that's one set of meanings, which is, God, this thing is magical, it's only this big, and look at what effect it has on, you know, my aunt, for the sake of argument, who's, you know, a pretty competent preacher as far as I can tell, being 2 years old. You know, and then if she just dismisses it, you know, her actions are going to determine the meaning of that phenomenon. So that's how the transformation of the semi-known thing into the more known thing occurs. It occurs almost always in a social context. You can explore things by yourself, but you rarely actually do that by yourself. It's almost always you plugged into a social apparatus, you know. So you might be doing the specific investigating, but the social apparatus is around you so that you can confer with it, and it also shapes the way that you're going to interact with that specific thing. Okay, so the unknown, that's generally, the unknown that you encounter, that's generally characterized using feminine symbolism. And I think the reason for that, there's a bunch of reasons, and we've talked about many of them. One reason is because females do the sexual selection in human beings, and so they act as the face of nature. Another reason is that you can think of new possibility always emerging out of the non-cultural background in some sense, you know. So, for example, let's say that we send an expedition to Mars and we're gathering new information as a consequence. The reason we're gathering new information is because we've gone out past the domain of our knowledge, in a sense, and we're interacting with something new. And in that interaction, new information is generated. Now, you can say that it's partly the act of the perceiver that's generating the new information, and you could say that it's partly the act of the culture, because we send robots to Mars, let's say, which is very, very difficult. So the culture goes there, but the individuals are observing. So the individuals are buttressed by the culture, but they're generating information because they're somewhere truly new. And so the information, you know, the unknown is a constant source of new information. So it's the place that gives birth to new information. And so that's another part of the reason that it seems to be symbolized in feminine form. You know, I'm just taking this in some sense as an empirical fact. I've looked at, it looks like that's how these stories work. And so I'd be trying to puzzle out why exactly that would be the case. You know, I also think it's the case that we tend to look at the world from a social cognitive perspective, right? We filter it through a social cognitive biological apparatus. And so we're very likely to see things in character form, and characters have sexes. And so that's going to happen. And then the attributes of femininity or the attributes of masculinity that get used as symbolic reference, in some sense, there's an arbitrariness about it. So, for example, for the Egyptians, you know, usually you have a sky god, but they had a sky goddess. Now, she generally represents the night sky, which is not exactly the same thing as the day sky. But, you know, you have to, it's so tricky because you have to look at the relationships between the characters in order to decide what all of them mean. And that shifts a little bit from story to story. So this is what would you say? It's an approximation of the underlying structure, but there's a fair bit of variance in it, just like there's variation in stories. So, well, the feminine element has a destructive element and a creative aspect. And you can see that people characterize their environments in that way. So, for example, you can map on environmental beliefs onto this structure. You can say that the environmentalist portrays nature as positive, portrays culture as negative, and portrays the individual as negative. And the basic story is rampaging individual as member of rapacious culture invading the pristine landscape of beautiful Mother Nature. Now, the thing about that story is it's true. The problem with the story is it's half true. Now, so for example, one thing that's interesting to conceptualize is that that's exactly the opposite of the frontier myth. Now, the frontier myth was a story that was used extensively in Europe to drive immigration into the United States. And it was used to some degree in Canada too. And the story was the exact opposite. It's the hero, so that would be the immigrant, pioneer, bringing the benefits of order to a savage wilderness. Well, that's also true. But it's so interesting that both of those things can be true, and they're completely different from one another. There's no commonality at all between those two stories, except for the way that they use the characters. There's a feminine character, a masculine character that represents culture, and then there's another character that represents the individual. And you could even see that, if you think about it historically, the U.S. was founded in some sense on a frontier myth, and, you know, that was too one-sided, and so by the time the 1960s came along, the early 1960s, it shifted to its opposite. And that you need that because systems have to oscillate to some degree to remain stable across time. They can't just be fixed in place. So they're going to play back and forth through the archetypes in an attempt to keep them balanced, because that's what you're trying to do. You're trying to keep them balanced. And so, well, you have the destructive and creative element of Mother Nature. You see that all the time in movies where the thing that the hero is striving against is the negative element of the unknown. How many of you have seen the movie Alien? Okay, so, you know, that's a pretty graphic representation of, well, those aliens are more reptilian in form. So they're almost like They're more at the dragon of chaos level of civilization. But they're like a terrible external force that's threatening human culture and the individual. It's exactly the opposite story that's played out in, what was the movie with all the blue creatures? Avatar, right. Avatar is exactly the opposite of that, where, you know, the unknown nature is just nothing but, it's like sweetness and bliss, and, you know, and the human culture is portrayed as spearheaded by greedy and rapacious individuals who are basically manifestations of the military-industrial complex. The funny thing is those both make good stories, and that's because, well, it's because they have enough archetypal truth so that there's many situations that they're relevant to. You know, sometimes Mother Nature is your best friend, and sometimes it's your worst enemy. And so you could go down to the jungles of Peru, and you could talk to the people who live there, and you could find out what they know about medicinal plants in the jungle, and you could bring home things to cure disease. Or you could just go down there and get lost in the jungle, and then you're dead. You know, in some sense, it's the same jungle. And whether it's positive or negative depends on what stance you take towards it and how you behave. And so the other thing that's really interesting about mythology, and this is the lovely element of mythology, is that part of what it does is tell you how to take this incredibly complex landscape that's positive and negative at the same time at every level of analysis, and how to navigate through it so that the proper balance is maintained as far as the entire system is concerned. So that culture has an orderly element, and that's what protects us here, and it has a tyrannical element, and that's what makes you treated like numbers at the University of Toronto. You know, you get both of those at exactly the same time. And then the archetypal individual has the same fundamental nature, hero or villain. And you know, those have archetypal roots, because the ultimate hero is the ultimate perfect person, and the ultimate villain is, you know, Satan himself in whatever form he happens to take. You know, and it doesn't take much knowledge of this structure before you can start seeing it manifest itself all over, especially in movies that are particularly popular, because they almost always have a central archetypal theme. The Marvel superhero movies are a really good example of that. So, you know, and if it's complex literature, the archetypes are mixed to some degree. So you have a hero who's not only a hero, you have a hero who has all sorts of flaws, you know, and he's in a culture, or she's in a culture that has positive elements and negative elements, and they're in a broader landscape that's characterized by exactly the same thing. So it's nuanced, you know, and the more sophisticated you get, the more you can tolerate that kind of nuance. And I think that's also one of the things, that's partly why literature is such a good antidote to ideology, because the more sophisticated the literature becomes, the more complex and fragmented in some sense, or no, differentiated. The more differentiated the archetypal landscape becomes. So when someone tells you a story, whatever the story happens to be, one of the things you can do when you know this substructure is you can say, okay, yeah, but where are the missing pieces? Where are they going? Because if they're not included, then they're generally projected onto something. You know, because they're there, you can't get away from them. They're there. How does the person account for them? You know, so.
It's with our fantasy that we first meet the unknown, right? Well, look, say you're going out with a new person. It's like, what do? You project a fantasy on them, and then you fall in love with the fantasy. And aren't you stupid? Because you're going to find out that the match between your damn fantasy and the actual person is tenuous at best. And so Jung would call that a projection of either the anima or the animus. You know, the anima is what a man projects onto a woman he finds desirable. It's like, oh, she's the perfect woman. It's like, well, how do you know that? You've like seen her for 4 seconds, you know, but it grips you. And the same thing happens in the opposite direction. And it's an action of instinct, you know. It's like you fall in love with the image. But interestingly enough, what you do in a relationship that works is that you actually, I think that what you see, it's a rough approximation, when you project the ideal and fall in love with it, you see what could be it could be that, but it's going to take you a hell of a lot of work, because like you got no shortage of flaws and the other person has no shortage of flaws, and so you're bringing your flaws together, and that's going to produce a lot of friction, and you're going to have to engage in a lot of dialogue before you approach that level of perfection again. But maybe you can do it, and then you get to live happily ever after. Well, wouldn't that be nice? Well, so the unconscious meets the unknown, and it meets it with imagination and fantasy and dream and art. That's how you take, see, you don't just go from what you don't know to fully articulated knowledge in one bloody leap. You can't do that. You have to extend pseudopods of fantasy and imagination into the unknown. That's kind of what theorizing is like, right? Even scientifically, you know, you don't know something scientifically, you generate a theory. Well, it's an imaginative representation that your unconscious is helping you generate. And so you meet the unknown with fantasy. That's what the unconscious is for. From the psychoanalytic perspective, that's what dreams do. And you can see why. You dream about the future. You know, it's like, well, what's the future going to be like? Well, you have a little imaginative story going on, and it's like, you don't really create it. It's sort of, you watch it unfold. You know, maybe you can tweak it here and there, but it sort of comes to you from wherever the hell things like that come from. You know, the unconscious, that's the psychoanalytic answer. It's not really much of an answer, because it's more like a representation of a place that we don't understand. But that's where creativity comes from. And I mean, some people are really creative right down to the bloody core. So in my clinical practice, I often see people who are high in openness because they're attracted to me because they watch my lectures. And you have to kind of be high in openness to like my lectures. So because, well, you do, because they go everywhere, you know, and they're not necessarily very orderly. So anyways, lots of my clients are really high in openness, and they're funny people often, especially if they're smart, because sometimes they have the most nihilistic intelligence you can imagine. It's just self-critical and nihilistic and brutally brutal, man, and smart. And so they just criticize themselves out of existence. And so often I have to just try to get them to quit listening to their chattering self-critical rationality and go out and create something, you know, with their massive creativity. And as long as they're doing that, they're engaged in the world and happy as hell. But as soon as that self-critical rationality comes in and shuts down the creativity, they're just like walking corpses, you know. And it's because if you're really open, like you're a tree, and it has some trunks, and you know, your most prominent trait is the most lively trunk. And if you're a creative person and you're not engaging in a creative enterprise, you're like a tree that has had its vitality amputated. And so this is not trivial. This is deeply, deeply, deeply rooted in your biology. And those are people often who have like dream lives you just can't believe. I have one client, he has like 4 spectacular dreams a week, and most of the time we just spend discussing them. I mean, God. And I had another client who could be lucid in her dreams, which is more common among women. She could ask the damn characters what they represented, and they would tell her. It was like, okay, that was pretty weird. And like a lot of the things they told her were really helpful, and they were not things that she wanted to hear. She basically, one of them told her if she was going to live, she'd have to go visit a slaughterhouse. And the reason for that was because she was raised as a little princess and protected from horrible Mother Nature until she hit puberty, in which time she turned into an evil villain, because that's how the family worked. Perfect child, evil teenager, overnight. And then, well, that was hard on her, and she wasn't prepared because she thought the world was princess world, and, you know, she couldn't go through a butcher store without having a fit. And no wonder, you know, like really, Jesus, you know, it's no wonder, but you do it. But she couldn't, so we used to go to butcher stores, and that would make her cry, and that she was a vegetarian, that would make her cry, and, you know, bemoan the cruelty of the world. And it's like, yeah, fair enough, man, those are bloody slabs of meat. It's like, I don't know why everyone isn't screaming when they walk through the butcher store, but you got to get used to it, man, because you can't live in the world otherwise. And so the dream character, who was a gypsy, told her that she had to go visit a slaughterhouse, which seemed rather impractical. And so I asked her if she could think of anything else to do, and she thought, well, why don't we go visit a funeral home and watch an embalming? And I thought, oh, good. That sounds like a fun way to spend a day. And so I phoned up a funeral parlor, and I said I had a client who was terrified of death. Yeah, and I was a therapist who was also a little shaky on the concept myself. And so they had no problem with that. They deal with death all the time, which is really something to think about, right? A human being can actually have an occupation where they do nothing but deal with death, and they don't go stark raving mad. It's like, what the hell's up with that? It's like working in a palliative care ward where your clients that you know have a relationship, all they're going to do is die this week, next week, the week after. People do that. It's like, those people are tough, man. They're tough. So anyways, we went and watched this embalming, which was, I have a rather high level of disgust sensitivity, so it was a little on the rough side for me. But she sat there, and first while she was not, we were outside this little room, she was not looking at that, man, no way. And she'd kind of go like this, and you know, that was pretty good. And then she'd go like this, and then she'd go like this, and then she watched it. And then she asked if she could go in, and she put on a glove and she touched the body, and she didn't have a fit, she didn't have a panic attack. And so she walked away from there learning that there was a hell of a lot more to her than she thought there was, and that she could see things that she didn't think she could see and live. And after that, she sort of had a touchstone. It's like, well, I'm kind of afraid of this. Well, is it as bad as going to see the embalming? No, it's not that bad. Well, I guess I can do it. It's like an initiation, right? She had an initiation. And so did I, you know, and I learned a lot from doing that. I learned that one of the things you need to do if you're going to be a human being is to prepare yourself to be useful in the face of death. And so when you have a parent that dies, which, you know, shatters people's ideas, often they can't even think about it. If you can't even think about that, man, you've got some thinking to do, because you need to be able to at least think about that, because otherwise you're just going to be a wasteland when it happens. And you never know, you could even have a higher ambition. Maybe you could even be useful when it happens, instead of being part of the heap of destroyed people who also have to be taken care of. You know, and that's brutal. You have to be brutal to be useful in the aftermath of your parents' death. You know, you don't get to crumble and fall apart, and no, you have every reason to. So you got to be kind of some tough monster to manage that. But do you want to be useful in the face of tragedy, or do you want to be pathetic?
Okay, well, so that's another issue in some sense that seems to make the postmodernist critique even more correct. How in the world are you going to extract out a canonical interpretation of something like that? It's like it's not possible. But here's the issue, as far as I can tell. So the postmodernists extended that critique to the world. They said, look, well, a text is complicated enough. You can't extract out a canonical interpretation. What about the world? The world's way more complicated than a text, and so there's an infinite number of ways that you can look at the world. And so how do we know that any one way is better than any other way? And that's a good question. Now, the postmodern answer was we can't. And that's not a good answer, because you drown in chaos under those circumstances, right? You can't make sense of anything. And that's not good, because it's not neutral to not make sense of things. It's very anxiety-provoking. It's very depressing, because if things are so chaotic that you can't get a handle on them, your body defaults into emergency preparation mode, and your heart rate goes up, and your immune system stops working, and like you burn yourself out. You age rapidly because you're surrounded by nothing you can control. That's an existential crisis, right? It's anxiety-provoking and depressing, very hard on people. And even more than that, it turns out that the way that we're constructed neurophysiologically is that we don't experience any positive emotion unless we have an aim and we can see ourselves progressing towards that aim. It isn't precisely attaining the aim that makes us happy, as you all know if you've ever attained anything, because as soon as you attain it, then the whole little game ends. Then you have to come up with another game, right? So it's Sisyphus. And that's okay, but it does show that the attainment can't be the thing that drives you, because it collapses the game. That's what happens when you graduate from university. It's like you're king of the mountain for one day, and then you're like serf at Starbucks for the next 5 years, you know? So, yeah. So what happens is that human beings are weird creatures because we're much more activated by having an aim and moving towards it than we are by attainment. And what that means is you have to have an aim, and that means you have to have an interpretation. And it also means that the nobler the aim, that's one way of thinking about it, the better your life. And that's a really interesting thing to know because, you know, you've heard ever since you were tiny that you should act like a good person and you shouldn't lie, for example. And you might think, well, why the hell should I act like a good person and why not lie? I mean, even a 3-year-old can ask that question because smart kids learn to lie earlier, by the way. And they think, well, why not twist the fabric of reality so that it serves your specific short-term needs? I mean, that's a great question. Why not do that? Why act morally? If you can get away with something and it brings you closer to something you want, well, why not do it? These are good questions. It's not self-evident. Well, it seems to me tied in with what I just mentioned. It's like you destabilize yourself and things become chaotic. That's not good. And if you don't have a noble aim, then you have nothing but shallow, trivial pleasures, and they don't sustain you. And that's not good because life is so difficult, it's so much suffering, it's so complex. It ends and everyone dies and it's painful. It's like without a noble aim, how can you withstand any of that? You can't. You become desperate, and once you become desperate, things go from bad to worse very rapidly when you become desperate. And so there's the idea of the noble aim, and it's not something. It's something that's necessary. It's the bread that people cannot live without, right? That's not physical bread. It's the noble aim. And what is that? Well, it was encapsulated in part in the story of Marduk. It's to pay attention. It's to speak properly. It's to confront chaos. It's to make a better world. It's something like that. And that's enough of a noble aim so that you can stand up without, cringing at the very thought of your own existence, so that you can do something that's worthwhile to justify your wretched position on the planet. So now the literary issue is that, look, you take a text, you can interpret it a variety of ways, but that's not right. This is where the postmodernists went wrong, because what you're looking for in a text, and in the world for that matter, is sufficient order and direction. So then we have to think, well, what does sufficient order and direction means? Well, you don't want to suffer so much that your life is unbearable, right? That just seems self-evident. Pain argues for itself. I think of pain as the fundamental reality because no one disputes it, right? I mean, even if you say that you don't believe in pain, it doesn't help when you're in pain. You still believe in it, right? You can't pry it up with logic and rationality. It just stands forth as what the fundament of existence, and that's actually quite useful to know. You say, well, you don't want any more of that than is absolutely necessary. And I think that's self-evident. And then you say, well, wait a minute, it's more complicated than that. You don't want any more of that that's necessary today, but also not tomorrow and not next week and not next month and not next year. So however you act now, better not compromise how you're going to be in a year, because that would just be counterproductive. That's part of the problem with short-term pleasures, right? It's like act in haste, repent at leisure. Everyone knows exactly what that means. So you have to act in a way that works now and tomorrow and next week and next month and so forth. And so you have to take your future self into account. And human beings can do that. And taking your future self into account isn't much different than taking other people into account, right? Because I remember there's this Simpson episode, and Homer downs a quart of mayonnaise and vodka. And he says, Marge says, you shouldn't really do that. And Homer says, that's a problem for future Homer. I'm sure glad I'm not that guy.